My name is Madeline, and I am 28 years old. I poured 6 years of my blood, sweat, and tears into building my father's corporate empire from the inside out. But this morning, a woman I had never seen before stormed into my executive boardroom, dripping in excessive designer labels, and announced to the shareholders that she was the true daughter of the CEO. Then she fired me on the spot in front of everyone. I stood there completely frozen, looking at the man I had called Dad my entire life. But if she is his real heir, then who am I? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had everything ripped away by the people you trusted most. The morning started exactly like any other high-stakes Tuesday at Bancroft Holdings. At precisely 9 a.m., I was standing at the head of our main executive boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. The room smelled of expensive roasted coffee and leather upholstery. 14 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their eyes locked on the projected slides I was meticulously walking them through. As the lead forensic risk analyst, this was my domain. I had built the entire compliance department from absolute scratch right after graduating. I had taken the chaotic, outdated financial systems of my father's company and forged them into an impenetrable fortress of modern corporate governance. I knew every loophole, every vulnerability, and I had closed them all. I clicked the remote in my hand, transitioning to a complex graph detailing our third quarter fiscal projections. I was explaining the potential market liabilities and the risk mitigation strategies my team had developed over the past 3 months. I felt confident. I felt in control. My voice was steady, projecting the authority I had earned through grueling 80-hour work weeks, skipped vacations, and endless nights analyzing balance sheets until my eyes burned. I was not just the boss's daughter. I was the financial shield protecting hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate assets. Just as I was about to break down our internal compliance audit results, a sudden loud crash echoed through the room. The heavy soundproof oak doors at the back of the boardroom were shoved violently open, hitting the wall with a sharp crack that made half the executives physically jump in their seats. I stopped mid-sentence, my presentation clicker suspended in the air. A woman strutted into the room. She looked to be around my age, but that was where any possible similarity ended. She was dripping in ostentatious wealth. She wore a tailored scarlet blazer that screamed haute couture, massive diamond earrings that caught the harsh fluorescent light, and carried a handbag that cost more than a luxury sedan. Her heels clicked loudly, aggressively against the polished hardwood floor, demanding absolute attention from every single person in the room. But she did not walk in alone. Flanking her on either side were two massive, stern-faced security guards from the lobby detail, men I normally greeted with a smile every morning. Now their expressions were stone cold, their hands resting defensively near their utility belts. "Excuse me," I said, maintaining my professional tone, despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "This is a closed board meeting. You cannot be in here." The woman did not even blink. She marched straight down the length of the long table, completely ignoring the bewildered stares of the executive board members. She stopped right in front of me, her heavy perfume overwhelming the scent of roasted coffee in the room. A smirk played on her lips, twisting her face into a mask of pure arrogance. She raised a thick red manila folder and slammed it violently down onto my open laptop keyboard. The impact echoed like a gunshot. "You are done here," she announced. Her voice was loud, sharp, and dripping with venom. "Gather your things and get out of my building." I stared at her, genuinely thinking this had to be some sort of bizarre prank or a severe security breach. I looked down at the folder. The word termination was stamped across the front in bold black letters. "I am the director of forensic risk," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "You do not have the authority to fire anyone here. I do not even know who you are." Her smirk widened into a full, triumphant grin. She turned slightly, addressing the shocked executives sitting around the table rather than speaking directly to me. "My name is Isabella," she declared loudly, "and I have every authority in this building. I am the true daughter of the CEO, and as of this morning I am taking my rightful place in this company." A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging panicked whispers. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. True daughter. The words made no logical sense. I was Richard Bancroft's daughter. I had grown up in his house. I had spent my entire adult life protecting his company. Isabella turned back to me, leaning in close so I could see the malicious gleam in her eyes. And my first official act is firing you for gross corporate embezzlement, she sneered. The accusation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Embezzlement. The very concept was so absurd, so entirely disconnected from reality, that my brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of the lie. I was a forensic accountant. My entire existence, my entire career was dedicated to hunting down stolen funds and securing corporate assets. I knew where every single penny in this entire corporation was allocated, down to the last decimal point. I possessed an untarnished record and a fierce reputation for absolute financial integrity. The idea that I would steal from the very company I bled to protect was laughable. This is completely insane. I shot back, my professional composure finally cracking as the adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I have built the compliance protocols for this entire network. You cannot just walk in here with fabricated claims and a delusional story about your identity. I expected the room to erupt in my defense. I expected the board members, people I had worked alongside for over half a decade, to demand security, remove this intruder immediately. But when I looked around the mahogany table, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. They were not looking at Isabella with outrage. They were looking down at their hands, shifting in their expensive suits, avoiding eye contact completely. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned my gaze to the far end of the long table, desperately seeking the one person who could end this madness instantly. My father. Richard Bancroft sat in his high-backed leather chair, his hands clasped tightly together, resting on the polished wood. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to slam his fist on the table, to order security to take this crazy woman away, to defend his daughter and the director of his company. I waited for the man who had raised me to protect me. Instead, the room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air grew thick and cold. The projector screen behind me continued to display the financial graphs I had built, a glowing testament to my hard work, while my entire world began to collapse in real time. My name is Madeline. Dad, tell them to stop this right now. My voice echoed against the soundproof walls of the executive boardroom, hitting the heavy silence and falling completely flat. I stared across the vast expanse of the mahogany table, waiting for the man who had raised me to stand up, to summon his authority, to order security to remove this unhinged woman from our building. I waited for Richard Bancroft to be my father. He did not look up. He kept his eyes glued to the polished wood, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped his own hands in his lap. The man who had walked me to my first day of kindergarten, who had proudly handed me my first financial calculator, was physically shrinking into his custom-tailored suit. The cowardice radiating from him was a tangible force in the room. He absolutely refused to meet my gaze. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, wrapping around my throat like a vice. He knew about this ambush. He was a willing participant in my destruction. The sharp clap of expensive leather shoes broke the quiet. A tall, impeccably dressed African-American man stepped out from the shadow of the doorway, moving with a predatory grace that immediately commanded the room. He wore a charcoal suit that fit far too perfectly, a crisp crimson tie, and a smug grin that made my stomach churn. This was Jamal. He did not ask for permission to speak or introduce himself to the board with any standard corporate decorum. He simply took control of the space, placing a protective, fiercely possessive hand on the small of Isabella's back. "I believe Richard has nothing to say to you," Jamal announced, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with raw condescension. "In fact, your father is officially stepping back from all day-to-day operations. As the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of this corporation, I will be handling the transition, starting with the immediate removal of unauthorized personnel." Jamal gave a subtle, practiced nod to the two massive security guards standing at attention by the heavy oak doors. Instantly, they lunged forward. Heavy hands clamped down on my upper arms, their grip bruising and completely unyielding. I gasped, instinctually struggling against their hold, but they were trained professionals, built like freight trains. My presentation clicker slipped from my fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor, rolling away from the financial models I had spent months perfecting. "Get your hands off me!" I demanded, thrashing against the guards while shooting a lethal glare at the new COO. "I am the director of forensic risk. I am a Bancroft." Jamal let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound bounced mockingly off the boardroom walls. He stepped closer, shaking his head slowly as if pitying a delusional child throwing a tantrum. "You really do not know, do you?" he asked, his tone turning dangerously soft. "You actually believe you belong in this room. You are not a Bancroft. You are a charity case." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I stopped struggling. The corporate executives seated around the table kept their heads down, studying their tablets, entirely complicit in this orchestrated humiliation. Men and women I had worked alongside for 6 years were abandoning me in real time. "Let us clear up the historical record for the board." Jamal continued, projecting his voice so every executive could hear the exact details of my ruin. Decades ago, Richard's late wife Helen was desperate for a child. When biology failed her, Richard bought her the next best thing, a foster kid. A stray pulled from the system to play house and keep a dying woman happy. You were a public relations stunt, a band-aid for a broken marriage, a temporary fix. That is all you have ever been. The breath violently left my lungs. The solid ground beneath my feet felt entirely unstable. A foster kid. My entire life, the bedtime stories, the family vacations, the legacy I thought I was inheriting, all of it was a fabricated illusion. I looked at Richard again, desperately praying for him to scream that this was a lie, to jump up and punch Jamal in the jaw. Richard just squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head toward the window, validating every single word Jamal had spoken. "Isabella," Jamal said, gesturing grandly to the woman standing proudly beside him, "is the actual biological heir, the product of Richard's true relationship with Caroline, long before you were ever brought into the picture as a pathetic consolation prize. Isabella has the bloodline. Isabella has the birthright. You just have a desk on the 42nd floor. And as of 5 minutes ago, you do not even have that." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical strike to the ribs. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and furious, blurring the sharp edges of the room. I fought them back with everything I had. I refused to let this arrogant stranger or this cruel woman see me break. I clamped my jaw shut, biting the inside of my cheek, until I tasted copper squaring my shoulders despite the guards pinning my arms to my sides. Jamal stepped right up into my personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic smell of fear in the room. He reached out and grabbed the woven corporate lanyard resting against my collarbone. With one violent, humiliating yank, he snapped the safety clasp. The nylon burned the back of my neck as he tore my executive identification badge away. He held the plastic card up to the fluorescent lights, inspecting my photo with a look of pure disgust. 6 years playing the dutiful little corporate soldier, Jamal sneered, tossing my badge onto the mahogany table like a piece of worthless garbage. 6 years scrubbing spreadsheets and building compliance networks, hoping Daddy would finally love you. It is almost sad. Escort the former employee off the premises. Do not let her stop at her desk. The guards tightened their grip, lifting me almost entirely off my feet. They began marching me backwards, pulling me away from the glowing projector screen, away from the life I had built. Through the gap between the guards, I watched the final devastating act of the coup. Isabella did not even look at me as I was dragged away. She adjusted the cuffs of her scarlet blazer, walked past my discarded termination folder, and pulled out the heavy leather chair at the absolute head of the conference table. The seat that had belonged to Richard. The seat that was supposed to be mine. She sat down smoothly, crossing her legs, radiating ultimate stolen authority. Security shoved me through the heavy doors. The massive oak slammed shut, cutting off my view of the empire I had built, trapping me in the sterile, brightly lit hallway. The descent to the underground parking garage had begun, and I was entirely alone. The elevator descent was a nauseating freefall. The two security guards stood on either side of me, their massive frames practically boxing me into the mirrored corner of the cab. The digital floor indicator flashed downward in rapid succession. 40, 30, 20. With every passing number, the gravity of what had just happened settled heavier onto my chest. I was not a Bancroft. I was a prop. A temporary placeholder suddenly deemed completely obsolete by the people I trusted most. The elevator chimed, and the heavy metal doors slid open to the subterranean chill of parking level P3. The air down here always smelled of damp concrete, harsh cleaning chemicals, and stale exhaust fumes. The guards marched me out of the elevator bay and finally released my arms, stepping back with synchronized precision. They did not say a single word. They simply pointed toward the concrete exit ramp and turned back to the elevators, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit, echoing cavern. I rubbed my bruised arms, my hands shaking violently. The initial shock was beginning to recede rapidly, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. I needed to get back to my apartment immediately. I needed to secure my personal backup laptop. I needed to call my own independent lawyers. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my rideshare app to call a black car, tapping the screen with a trembling thumb. A bright red error message immediately flooded the screen. Payment method declined. I frowned, swiping to my secondary corporate account. Denied. I opened my banking app, my heart rate accelerating to a frantic rhythm. Account frozen. Access denied. Please contact your corporate administrator. They had not just fired me. They had digitally erased me. Every company credit card, every expense account, every financial safety net tied to my name under the Bancroft Holdings umbrella had been severed in the time it took me to ride the elevator down 40 floors. My access was wiped. My funds were locked. I was entirely stranded. I shoved the useless phone back into my pocket and turned toward the VIP executive parking sector. My company-issued Porsche Panamera was parked in its reserved spot, gleaming under the harsh halogen lights. If I could just get to the car, I could drive home and figure out my next strategic move. But as I rounded the thick concrete pillar, my blood ran cold. Jamal was waiting for me. He had obviously taken the private executive express elevator down, bypassing the standard floors and beating me to the garage. He was leaning casually against the sleek black hood of my car, his arms crossed over his tailored charcoal suit. The arrogant smirk from the boardroom was still firmly planted on his face. Standing behind him were two more security guards, different from the ones who had escorted me down, looking equally menacing and ready for an altercation. "Going somewhere, Madeline?" Jamal asked. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, loud and deliberately mocking. "Move away from my car, Jamal," I demanded. I kept my chin high, refusing to let my voice shake. "I am leaving this building." He let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Your car? That is absolutely hilarious." He pushed himself off the hood and took a slow, measured step toward me. "Let us get something straight right now. You own absolutely nothing. You do not own the luxury apartment the company leases for you. You do not own the corporate accounts you just tried to use to call a cab. And you certainly do not own this vehicle." He extended an open palm toward me. "Hand over the keys." I stared at him, my fingernails digging fiercely into my palms. "I worked 80-hour weeks for 6 straight years for this company," I fired back, stepping forward. "I built the entire risk infrastructure that keeps the federal regulators off your backs. I gave up holidays, I skipped weekends. I bled for this firm to clean up the financial messes Richard left behind. I earned this. Earned. And we thank you for your dedicated service, charity case." Jamal sneered, his eyes narrowing with cruel delight. "You were a very useful little worker bee. You scrubbed the books, you tightened the compliance, and you made the company look absolutely spotless on paper. Which is exactly what we needed you to do. But now the heavy lifting is done. You are completely obsolete. Give me the keys, Madeline. Do not make me ask the guards to physically take them from you. It will just be embarrassing for everyone." I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold metal of the key fob. I wanted to throw it directly at his face. Instead, I pulled it out, holding it tightly in my fist. "Why?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, demanding tone. "If Isabella is the true biological heir, why stage this ridiculous ambush today? Why not fire me properly through human resources? Jamal's eyes lit up with predatory glee. He could not resist bragging. He wanted me to know exactly how thoroughly I had been defeated to rub my face in the grand architecture of his victory. Because little orphan, tomorrow morning Isabella and I are closing the biggest tech merger in the history of this sector, he boasted, his chest puffing out with overwhelming arrogance. We are selling Bancroft Holdings to a global tech conglomerate. The valuation is astronomical. And because of the pristine compliance network you so graciously built for us, the buyers have agreed to a massive premium. We are about to cash out for hundreds of millions of dollars. The pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. They were gutting the company. They were taking the empire I had fortified and selling it to the highest bidder to line their own pockets. If I had stayed in my position for one more day, my forensic audits would have uncovered the impending sale. I would have blocked the transfer of assets. I was the only person in the building smart enough to stop them, so I had to be removed. You are going to destroy my father's legacy for a quick payout, I said, utterly horrified by the sheer greed. It is not his legacy anymore, Jamal corrected sharply, pointing a finger at me. It is Isabella's. And soon it will be cold, hard cash. We are going to be billionaires, Madeline. And you are going to be a footnote, a foster kid who played dress-up in the corporate world until the real adults showed up to collect the prize. He snapped his fingers impatiently. The keys, now. I looked at the two guards stepping forward, their hands resting near their belts. I had no leverage. I had no power left in this building. I opened my hand and let the heavy key fob drop into Jamal's waiting palm. He caught it seamlessly, a triumphant grin stretching across his face. He pressed the unlock button and the Porsche chirped happily, its headlights flashing brightly in the dim garage. He opened the driver's side door, but before getting in, he paused. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a slim, expensive leather money clip. He extracted a single crisp $20 bill. He held it up between his index and middle finger, making sure I saw Washington's face. I almost forgot he mocked, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. We froze your accounts. You cannot even afford a ride home. Jamal flicked his wrist. The $20 bill fluttered through the damp garage air and landed on the oil-stained concrete right at the tip of my shoes. Take the bus, Madeline, he sneered. Try not to get mugged. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, the aggressive sound reverberating through the underground structure. The tires screeched loudly as he aggressively pulled out of the parking space, speeding up the exit ramp and leaving a cloud of exhaust in his wake. The two security guards turned and walked away toward the concrete stairwell, their job complete. I stood completely alone in the freezing, dimly lit parking garage. The silence rushed back in, deafening and heavy. I looked down at the crumpled $20 bill resting on the dirty concrete. 6 years of absolute devotion. 6 years of building an empire from the ground up, reduced to a discarded piece of paper on a garage floor. My career was gone. My family was a lie. My entire reality had been shattered into a million jagged pieces. I bent down, my fingers completely numb against the freezing concrete, and picked up the crumpled $20 bill Jamal had thrown at my feet. The rough texture of the paper felt like a physical manifestation of my own discarded pride. I turned my back on the empty parking space, on the gleaming Porsche I no longer owned, and began the long, agonizing walk up the steep concrete ramp toward the street-level exit. The air grew progressively heavier with every step, thick with the atmospheric pressure of the massive storm that had been threatening downtown Chicago all morning. As I breached the surface, stepping out from beneath the protective concrete overhang of Bancroft Holdings, the sky violently tore open. A freezing torrential downpour instantly engulfed the city. The rain did not just fall, it came down in aggressive diagonal sheets, stinging my exposed skin and instantly plastering my tailored silk blouse to my back. My expensive designer blazer, a symbol of the high-powered executive life I had possessed just 20 minutes ago, absorbed the freezing water like a heavy sponge. I shivered violently, the bitter chill seeping directly into my bones, but I forced my legs to keep moving. I absolutely refused to stand on the sidewalk in front of my father's corporate headquarters, looking like a defeated stray animal waiting to be put out of its misery. I stumbled blindly down the flooded block, my heels slipping on the slick pavement, desperately seeking the meager shelter of a cracked plexiglass bus stop enclosure at the corner. The wind howled through the broken panels, whipping wet strands of hair across my face and eyes. I huddled on the damp, freezing metal bench, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as the storm raged around me. I needed to figure out exactly how much loose cash I possessed to survive the next few hours before I could formulate any kind of strategic retaliation. I swung my personal handbag onto my lap. It was a sturdy vintage leather tote I had carried everywhere for years, a high school graduation gift from Helen, the woman I had loved and believed to be my biological mother. I unzipped the main compartment and plunged my freezing wet hands inside. I frantically dug past my makeup bag, a heavy planner, and a few stray pens, my fingers blindly searching the dark corners for any loose coins or a forgotten emergency bill. My fingers scraped hard against the very bottom of the thick leather lining. As I pressed down heavily, feeling for a rogue quarter, the flat-bottom panel suddenly shifted. It did not merely bend under my weight. It depressed with a distinct, unnatural click that vibrated up my arm. I froze completely, my breath catching sharply in my throat. I ran my thumb along the inner seam of the tote, tracing the tight stitching. There was a hidden, rigid ridge buried deep within the dark lining. A tiny, expertly concealed zipper tab sat flush against the leather seam. I had carried this exact bag every single day for 10 long years and had never once noticed it was altered. My pulse began to pound against my temples loud and fast, drowning out the sound of the torrential rain hitting the bus shelter roof. With trembling, freezing fingers, I hooked my fingernail under the tiny metal zipper pull and yanked it across the base of the bag. The false bottom peeled back smoothly, revealing a shallow, secret compartment hidden beneath the normal lining. I reached inside the dark space and pulled out a heavy, antique brass key. It was ice cold and substantial in my palm, carrying the undeniable weight of something old, secure, and incredibly important. I turned it over in the dim light of the street lamps. Engraved deeply onto the wide bow of the key was a specific street address and a 4-digit vault number. My eyes widened drastically as I instantly recognized the prestigious street name. It was not a standard storage locker facility or a residential apartment building. It was the exact address of the most elite, impenetrable private bank in the Chicago financial district, an institution exclusively utilized by billionaires and shadow corporations. Underneath the heavy brass key lay a thick, cream-colored envelope. The heavy cardstock was crisp and pristine, completely untouched by the dampness of my bag or the raging storm outside. I flipped the envelope over, and my heart effectively stopped beating in my chest. My name was written across the front center in an elegant, sweeping cursive ink. It was Helen's handwriting, the woman who had taken me and the woman Jamal had cruelly dismissed as my foster mother just moments ago. Below my name, written in the exact same steady, deliberate ink, was a strict, unambiguous instruction. For Maddie, only when you turn 28. I stared at the envelope, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, connecting impossible, terrifying dots. I had turned 28 exactly 2 days ago. Helen had passed away when I was 19 years old. She had secretly hidden this heavy vault key and this sealed letter inside a graduation gift she gave me years before her sudden death. She had meticulously designed this. She had known I would carry this bag, knowing it would remain an absolute secret until the exact moment I crossed that specific age threshold. She had orchestrated this hidden dead drop from the grave. She had known even back then that a day would inevitably come when I would desperately need whatever this antique key unlocked. The paralyzing, suffocating despair that had entirely consumed me in the underground parking garage evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a burning, laser-focused clarity. I was not just a discarded charity case cast out onto the street. Helen had not abandoned me. She had left me a roadmap. The heavy, loud hiss of pneumatic air brakes shattered my intense focus. A city bus pulled up to the flooded curb, its massive windshield wipers violently slapping the heavy rain away. The folding doors swung open with a loud mechanical groan. I stood up from the metal bench, gripping the antique brass key so tightly in my fist that the engraved numbers dug painfully into my skin. I completely ignored the freezing rain soaking through my ruined clothes. I ignored the devastating public humiliation I had just endured in the boardroom. I stepped up onto the rubber tread of the bus stairs and handed the driver Jamal's crumpled $20 bill. The driver gave me a strange, judgmental look, taking in my drenched corporate attire and shivering frame, but he wordlessly handed me a handful of change and a printed transfer ticket. I moved purposefully down the narrow, brightly lit aisle as the bus lurched heavily forward, merging back into the stormy, gridlocked traffic. I sank into a hard plastic seat near the back doors, pulling my damp, ruined blazer tightly around my shivering shoulders. I did not look out the rain-streaked window at the towering corporate skyscraper I was leaving behind. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, my jaw set with absolute determination. The address stamped on the heavy brass key burned like a beacon in my mind. I was heading straight for the financial district. I was going to march into that elite private bank, and I was going to find out exactly what Helen had buried in that vault for me to find. The bus jolted to a violent halt at the corner of LaSalle and Adams. I stepped off the rubber transit stairs and back into the freezing deluge of the financial district. Towering skyscrapers of glass and steel loomed overhead, their peaks swallowed by heavy charcoal storm clouds. The wind whipped violently through the urban canyon, driving the rain sideways, but I barely registered the biting cold. My fingers were locked in a death grip around the heavy brass key in my coat pocket. It was my only remaining weapon. Half a block down stood the First Sterling Heritage Bank. It was not a retail branch for everyday checking accounts. It was a fortress of limestone and granite built a century ago, catering exclusively to generational wealth, massive corporate trusts, and elite private clients. Helen had always maintained a quiet, untouchable presence here. I pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors, stepping out of the chaotic storm and into a world of hushed, intimidating opulence. The transition was instantly jarring. The air inside was warm and scented with cedar and expensive floor wax. Massive Corinthian marble pillars stretched up toward a vaulted ceiling adorned with intricate gold leaf. The floor was a checkerboard of pristine black and white marble that echoed softly with the footsteps of executives in bespoke suits. I stood near the entrance, shivering uncontrollably, my soaked silk blouse clinging to my skin and my ruined blazer dripping water onto the immaculate floor. I knew I looked entirely out of place. I pulled my wet lapels closer together, trying to project an air of belonging, and started to walk toward the main reception desk to ask for the vault custodian. Before I could take 3 steps, a booming, furious voice echoed across the quiet lobby. It was a voice that had commanded my respect for my entire life, a voice I had sought approval from since I was a little girl. Now it made my blood run absolutely ice cold. I stopped dead in my tracks. I darted behind the nearest marble pillar, pressing my wet back against the cold stone, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I carefully edged my face around the side of the massive column to look across the expansive room. There, standing at the polished mahogany VIP service desk, was Richard. He was not alone. Clinging to his arm was a woman I recognized instantly, though I had only ever seen her in fleeting glimpses at corporate charity galas years ago. Caroline, Isabella's mother, the woman who had apparently been living in the shadows of my father's life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She looked exactly like an older, sharper version of Isabella, wearing a sleek cashmere coat and staring down her nose at the bank staff with absolute disdain. Richard was leaning aggressively over the desk, invading the personal space of a stern-looking senior bank manager. Richard's face was flushed red with anger, his usual polished corporate mask completely slipping away. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Bancroft Holdings," Richard bellowed, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge of panic disguised as rage. "And I am telling you that my former director of forensic risk has just gone rogue. She is a severe flight risk and a highly dangerous individual. She has systematically embezzled millions from my corporation over the last 3 years. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp of pure shock. He was not just firing me. He was actively attempting to frame me for the exact crimes he and Jamal were currently committing. As a forensic accountant, being formally accused of corporate embezzlement was an absolute career death sentence. He was trying to ensure I would be locked in a federal holding cell before I could ever expose their fraudulent tech merger. He was burning my life to the ground to cover his own tracks. The bank manager adjusted his glasses, maintaining a rigid, unimpressed posture. Sir, I understand your position, but this institution requires formal legal documentation, a federal warrant, or a direct court order to freeze any private safety deposit boxes. We cannot simply lock an account based on verbal accusations, regardless of your corporate title. Caroline slammed her manicured hand onto the mahogany desk. This is absolutely unacceptable, she snapped, her voice shrill and dripping with toxic entitlement. That girl is a common thief, a stray foster child who wormed her way into my family's legacy. Any assets tied to the Helen Bancroft estate legally belong to my husband and my biological daughter. You need to freeze that specific vault right now before that criminal walks through your front doors and empties it. The sheer ruthlessness of their strategy washed over me. They knew about the vault, or at least they strongly suspected Helen had left something highly valuable behind, and they were scrambling to cut off my access before I even knew it existed. They had frozen my corporate accounts, ripped away my career, confiscated my car, and now they were actively hunting down the last shred of Helen's memory to starve me out completely. If Richard turned his head even slightly to the left, he would see me standing there dripping wet and completely defenseless. He would have the armed bank security detain me on the spot, call the police, and hand me over on fabricated felony charges. I would be arrested in the middle of the financial district, and Jamal would close his fraudulent $200 million merger without a single obstacle in his way. I had to disappear immediately. I pulled the wet hood of my blazer up over my head, obscuring my face as much as physically possible. I pressed myself tightly against the shadows of the marble pillar, breathing in shallow, silent gasps. I rapidly scanned the layout of the grand lobby. I knew how high-security institutions like this operated. The main elevators were completely exposed, sitting directly in Richard's line of sight. I could not use them, but elite banks always had secondary routes. I looked past the teller stations, my eyes tracking along the perimeter wall. There, tucked away behind a decorative fern near the back administrative offices, was a heavy, unmarked steel door. A discreet card reader was mounted on the wall beside it. It was a restricted service corridor, likely used by armed guards and vault custodians for secure transfers out of the public eye. I watched the door intently. A young bank associate carrying a stack of heavy ledger files approached the card reader. He swiped his identification badge. A sharp electronic beep echoed, and the heavy steel door clicked ajar. He pushed it open and stepped through. This was my only window. I did not hesitate. I abandoned the safety of the marble pillar and sprinted across the polished floor, keeping my head down and stepping lightly to prevent my wet shoes from squeaking against the stone. The heavy door was slowly swinging shut on its hydraulic hinge. I reached out my fingers, catching the cold metal edge just a fraction of a second before the locking mechanism engaged. I held my breath, terrified that the click of the latch had been too loud. I glanced back over my shoulder. Richard was still violently arguing with the manager, his back completely turned to me, while Caroline demanded to speak to the bank president. They had not seen me. I pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip my body inside, then let it shut silently behind me. The noise of the lobby instantly vanished, replaced by the dead soundproof quiet of a restricted concrete corridor. The air in the stairwell was incredibly cold and smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. A glowing red sign on the concrete wall pointed downward, indicating the subterranean vault levels. I gripped the freezing steel handrail and began my descent into the underground, moving closer to whatever secret Helen had buried in the dark. The echo of my wet shoes against the steel grating sounded like gunshots in the dead, soundproof quiet of the restricted corridor. The air grew progressively colder with every step down the concrete stairwell, transitioning from the raw, biting chill of the Chicago storm to the sterile, climate-controlled freeze of a subterranean fortress. I reached the bottom landing and faced a massive brushed steel door devoid of any handles or keyholes. I pushed my weight against the heavy metal, and it yielded with a thick pneumatic hiss. I stumbled out of the dim stairwell and into a blindingly bright, immaculate security antechamber. The floors were polished white granite reflecting the harsh fluorescent panels overhead. Behind a thick wall of bulletproof glass, two armed security contractors in tactical suits immediately stopped monitoring their screens. Their hands moved swiftly to rest on the holsters at their hips as their eyes locked onto my drenched, disheveled appearance. I was shivering violently, a puddle of rainwater already forming around my ruined leather heels. I tightened my grip on the antique brass key hidden in my pocket, bracing myself for another physical altercation, my heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. "Stand down. She is exactly where she is supposed to be." A sharp, incredibly authoritative voice sliced through the tense silence of the sterile room before the guards could take a single step toward me. I spun around, my wet hair whipping across my face. A man in his late 60s stood near the entrance of the primary vault corridor. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit with a subtle pinstripe, a gold pocket watch chain draped elegantly across his vest, and wire-rimmed spectacles resting on a sharp aquiline nose. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his piercing gray eyes studied me with an intense, unsettling familiarity. He moved across the granite floor with a quiet, practiced grace, exuding the kind of quiet power that did not need to shout to be obeyed. "Madeline," he said, his voice smooth, resonant, and deeply calm, "you look exactly the way she said you would, and you are precisely on time." "Who are you?" I demanded, taking a defensive step backward, my muscles coiled and ready to run. "Elias Vance," he replied, gesturing politely toward the heavy titanium blast doors behind him. "I am the senior trust attorney for the Helen Bancroft estate. I have been waiting for you to walk through those doors for 9 long years. Please come with me right now. We have an immense amount of ground to cover and a dangerously narrow window before your father realizes you have bypassed his blockade upstairs." Elias flashed a high-clearance biometric card at the guards behind the glass. They instantly relaxed their posture and returned to their monitors. He placed his hand on a glowing green scanner, and the massive circular titanium vault doors groaned open, revealing rows of impenetrable steel. He led me down the glowing corridor past aisles of countless safety deposit boxes until we reached a private soundproof viewing room at the very back of the facility. The room was furnished sparsely with a heavy oak table and 2 high-backed leather chairs. The absolute silence of the room pressed heavily against my eardrums. Elias signaled a bank custodian through the glass partition. A moment later, the man wheeled in a long, heavy stainless steel lockbox, placed it precisely in the center of the oak table, bowed silently, and exited, sealing the heavy door behind him. Elias pulled a slender silver key from his vest pocket and looked at me expectantly. "Your key, Madeline," he instructed softly. I pulled the freezing brass key from my pocket and slid it into the right-hand lock. He placed his silver key into the left. On his subtle nod, we turned them simultaneously. The heavy internal steel latches disengaged with a loud, satisfying mechanical clack. Elias lifted the heavy lid back and stepped away, offering me the floor. I stepped forward, expecting to find stacks of emergency cash bearer bonds, or perhaps family jewels to fence for survival money. Instead, the box was packed to the brim with dense bound stacks of aging legal paper, faded blueprints, and thick packets of complex, heavily annotated proprietary code. At the very top rested a worn, leather-bound journal bearing Helen's embossed initials. I looked up at Elias, completely bewildered and fighting a rising tide of panic. "What is all this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Where are the financial assets, the safety nets?" "Jamal and Richard froze my accounts. They are selling the company tomorrow morning. They stripped my security clearance to keep me blind. I need leverage, Elias. I do not need old paperwork." Elias leaned casually against the edge of the oak table, his gray eyes locking onto mine with absolute unyielding gravity. You are looking at the leverage, Madeline. You are looking at the foundational architecture of the entire Bancroft empire. You have operated under a meticulously constructed lie for your entire adult life. Richard Bancroft did not found that tech empire. He did not code the proprietary compliance software you have been blindly auditing and protecting for the last 6 years. He has absolutely no understanding of the algorithms that actually govern those federal networks. I stared at him, the bitter chill of my wet clothes entirely forgotten. That is impossible, I countered, shaking my head. Richard built the original infrastructure in his 20s. It is corporate legend. It is in every textbook. It is corporate mythology, Elias corrected sharply, his tone filled with disgust. Richard was a charismatic salesman, a loud figurehead with a charming smile and a ruthless talent for shaking hands in elite country clubs. Your mother Helen was the engineering genius. She was the architect. She wrote the foundational code in the damp basement of their first home. She secured the core patents under an anonymous holding shell to protect the intellectual property from Richard's aggressive, reckless early creditors. The words hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. Helen had been a quiet, soft-spoken woman who spent her days tending to her greenhouse and hosting charity luncheons. She had played the dutiful, supportive corporate wife to absolute perfection. It was a flawless, lifelong disguise. I thought about all those 80-hour work weeks I had spent scrubbing the company's code, marveling at the brilliant efficiency of the legacy algorithms. I had been auditing my own mother's brilliance. When Helen passed away suddenly, Elias continued, his voice dropping an octave. Richard seized the ultimate opportunity. He buried her involvement completely. He installed himself as the sole visionary CEO, claiming her patents as his own corporate creations. He built his entire fortune, his massive legacy, and his untouchable reputation on the back of your mother's stolen genius. The massive tech merger Jamal had just bragged about in the garage suddenly took on a terrifying new context. The sickening realization flooded my mind, making the room spin. They are selling her code, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They are attempting to sell her code. Elias amended, a fierce, predatory smile, finally touching the corners of his mouth. The buyers are paying hundreds of millions of dollars for the proprietary rights to the federal compliance networks. Networks that Richard does not actually own and has never owned. Helen knew Richard's unquenchable greed would eventually consume him. She knew a day would come when he would try to liquidate her life's work for a quick payout. So she legally shielded the core patents and locked the definitive proof inside this very vault, waiting for you to come of age. Elias reached deep into the steel box and hauled out a massive, incredibly heavy stack of bound, notarized legal documents. He slammed the thick stack down onto the center of the oak table. The loud thud echoed sharply in the small, quiet room. These are the original, unalterable patents. The true, undeniable architecture of your mother's empire, Elias stated, sliding the heavy stack directly across the polished wood until it rested firmly against my hands. And according to the irrevocable trust she established long before her death upon your 28th birthday, complete legal ownership of every single patent transfers exclusively to you. My fingers dragged across the textured vellum of the topmost folder. I flipped open the heavy cover, greeted by a labyrinth of dense corporate legalese. Entire paragraphs were obscured by thick black redaction blocks hiding the intricate pathways of the money, but the visible text was a staggering series of revelations. I scanned the pages, my eyes jumping from one undeniable clause to the next. Helen had not simply registered a few software patents under a pseudonym to protect her work. She had engineered an impenetrable financial fortress right under Richard's nose. I turned the page, uncovering the central architecture of her trap. She had established a shadow entity named Vanguard Apex Holdings. It was a ghost corporation existing entirely off the books, legally insulated by layers of anonymous offshore proxies. It was completely detached from the Bancroft Holdings public filings. I read through the asset manifest, my breath catching in my throat. Vanguard Apex owned the proprietary source code. It owned the federal compliance algorithms. It owned the encryption keys that kept the entire financial sector secure. Every single tool I had spent 6 years auditing and optimizing belonged to this invisible entity. But Helen did not stop at intellectual property. I flipped to the third section of the massive binder. Attached was a commercial real estate deed, stamped and formally notarized by the city of Chicago. My eyes traced the property lines and the lot numbers. Vanguard Apex did not just own the digital architecture of the Bancroft Empire, it owned the physical architecture. The 40-story glass and steel skyscraper towering directly above us, the very building where Jamal had just fired me, and security had physically dragged me out, belonged entirely to Vanguard Apex. Richard Bancroft had been paying astronomical corporate rent to a phantom landlord for over 2 decades. He was nothing more than a tenant. Elias watched me process the sheer magnitude of the information, his posture perfectly still allowing the reality to set in. I looked up at him, the math frantically calculating in my head. Bancroft Holdings is a hollow shell. I stated the truth, tasting sharp and metallic on my tongue. Richard does not own anything of actual value. He is operating a glorified storefront. He has been leasing the software in the building from Helen's ghost company this entire time. Precisely, Elias confirmed, his voice a low, steady hum that resonated in the quiet vault. Richard is a highly paid property manager. He generates the operational revenue, pays the immense overhead, and funds the extravagant lifestyle he believes he earned. But the core assets, the actual intrinsic value that the global tech conglomerate is trying to purchase tomorrow morning, belong exclusively to Vanguard Apex. He never bothered to look past his own ego to see who actually held the title. I flipped to the final execution clause of the trust document. There it was, spelled out in uncompromising stark black ink. Upon the event of Helen Bancroft's passing, Vanguard Apex Holdings would be placed into a blind, irrevocable trust. The singular beneficiary listed was Madeline Bancroft. The execution trigger date was my 28th birthday. Exactly 48 hours ago, the impenetrable legal firewall Helen had built automatically dissolved. 100% of the corporate shares, the intellectual property rights, the real estate deeds, and the shadow accounts had transferred directly, quietly, and completely into my name. The profound irony of Jamal and Isabella's ambush struck me with full force. They thought they were orchestrating the ultimate corporate coup. They had ousted me to clear the runway for a $200 million sale, believing I was the only liability left on the board. But they were attempting to sell an empty cardboard box. They could not transfer the patents because they did not own the patents. They could not sell the headquarters because they did not own the building. If they signed those acquisition papers tomorrow morning, they would be committing massive multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. The freezing dampness of my ruined silk blouse vanished. The dull, aching bruises from the security guards faded completely from my memory. The devastating sting of being called a charity case evaporated instantly, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I was not a stray pulled from the system to play house. I was the fail-safe. Helen had seen Richard's inevitable betrayal coming from miles away. She knew his greed would eventually drive him to steal her legacy and hand it over to his biological daughter. She had forged me into the ultimate weapon to destroy him, hiding me in plain sight. I carefully closed the heavy leather binder, resting my hands flat against the cool cover. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders. I reached up and wiped the last remaining drop of rainwater from my cheek. The terrified, heartbroken foster kid, who had been dragged out of the executive boardroom, was dead. She had been left on the oily floor of the parking garage. The woman sitting in the subterranean vault of the First Sterling Heritage Bank was the sole owner of a billion-dollar portfolio. "They are closing the deal at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion echoing sharply off the steel walls. "Jamal is bringing the buyers to the executive suite to sign the final transfer agreements and finalize the payout." Elias smiled, a sharp, dangerous glint reflecting in his gray eyes. "Then we have a rather tight deadline, Madeline. What are your precise instructions?" I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the absolute weight of my new reality settle firmly into my bones. Gather every single original document I ordered, pushing the heavy leather chair back and standing up. Draft an immediate cease and desist. Prepare the asset freeze protocols. We are going to war. I left the subterranean security of the First Sterling Heritage Bank and stepped back out into the Chicago storm. The freezing rain had not let up, but the biting cold no longer registered. The fire of Helen's revelation burned hot and steady in my chest. I hailed a passing city cab with a sharp whistle, paying the driver with the last of the cash I had scraped together from my emergency desk fund earlier that week. The ride back to my apartment was a blur of neon streetlights bleeding through rain-slicked windows. I used the time to mentally map out the digital counteroffensive. I needed secure internet access. I needed my encrypted files. The cab dropped me off in front of my high-rise building in the South Loop. I rushed through the lobby, completely ignoring the doorman, and rode the elevator up to the 14th floor. I stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway, my mind already calculating decryption keys and secure server pathways. Then I saw my front door. The heavy oak frame was violently splintered. The deadbolt hung completely loose, the metal strike plate ripped cleanly out of the drywall. The door was pushed ajar, resting at a crooked, unnatural angle. I froze, my pulse instantly accelerating. I pushed the ruined door open with the toe of my damp shoe and stepped cautiously into the entryway. My apartment was entirely unrecognizable. It looked like a localized hurricane had torn through the rooms. The sleek minimalist sanctuary I had meticulously decorated was completely trashed. The plush sofa cushions were slashed open, white synthetic stuffing scattered across the hardwood floor like fresh snow. Every single drawer in my kitchen had been yanked out and violently emptied, sending utensils and glass plates shattering across the ceramic tiles. My bookshelf was cleared, novels and heavy reference texts lying face down with their spines cracked. I walked slowly into the bedroom. My mattress was flipped off the box spring and gutted. The contents of my closet were violently dragged off their hangers, forming a chaotic pile of fabric on the floor. This was not a standard robbery. The television was still mounted to the wall. My jewelry box was knocked over, but the gold chains and pearl earrings were completely ignored. I looked at my shattered home office desk. The heavy monitor was face down, the power cords ripped brutally from the wall. They were not looking for pawnable valuables. They were conducting a desperate, frantic search for data. They were tearing my life apart, looking for hard drives, encrypted flash drives, or printed audit ledgers. Jamal knew I was meticulous. He knew I rarely left things to chance. He wanted to guarantee I possessed absolutely nothing that could jeopardize the $200 million merger tomorrow morning. The sharp, intrusive ringing of my personal cell phone pierced the dead silence of the destroyed apartment. I pulled the device from my damp pocket. The caller identification displayed a name that made my stomach churn with pure disgust. Richard Bancroft. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, standing absolutely still amidst the wreckage of my bedroom. "Madeline, sweetheart," Richard began. His voice was smooth, resonant, and dripping with a sickeningly paternal warmth. It was the exact tone he used when negotiating hostile corporate takeovers, a manufactured empathy designed to disarm and pacify. "I am so glad you picked up." I did not say a word. I stared at my slashed mattress. "Listen to me," Richard continued, completely unbothered by my silence. "Things got a little out of hand today in the boardroom. Isabella is just highly emotional right now. She is under an immense amount of pressure with this upcoming merger, and her delivery was poorly executed. We are all operating on high stress levels. I want to apologize for how abruptly the transition was handled." The sheer audacity of his gaslighting was breathtaking. He was actively attempting to reframe a coordinated, vicious corporate execution as a minor family misunderstanding. "You watched Jamal's security team physically assault me and drag me out of the building," I stated, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of warmth. "You sat there and stared at the table while they stripped my credentials. Do not attempt to pacify me, Richard." "Now, Madeline, let us not dwell on the negative," he replied smoothly, shifting seamlessly into his transactional persona. "I want to make things right. You have been a dedicated employee, and I want to ensure you have a soft landing. I am prepared to offer you a highly generous severance package. $50,000 wired directly to your personal account by midnight. $50,000. It was a pathetic, insulting fraction of the hundreds of millions he was attempting to steal from Helen's legacy tomorrow. There are just a few standard administrative conditions attached to the severance. Richard added, his tone hardening just a fraction. You will need to sign a blanket non-disclosure agreement regarding all internal operations at Bancroft Holdings. I also think it would be incredibly beneficial for you to get a fresh start. You need to relocate, somewhere outside of Illinois. A clean break is exactly what you need right now to clear your head. He wanted me silenced and banished. He wanted me out of the state before the ink dried on his fraudulent merger documents. We are family. Madeline Richard pressed, leaning heavily into his ultimate manipulative tactic. I took you in when you had absolutely nothing. I clothed you. I put a roof over your head. I raised you as my own flesh and blood. You owe me this smooth transition. Do not be ungrateful after everything I have generously provided for you. I looked down at a framed photograph of Helen that had been carelessly smashed on the floor, the glass spiderwebbed across her smiling face. Richard had provided nothing. Helen had built the empire. Helen had funded our lives. Richard had merely played the role of a parasitic king, feeding off the genius of a woman he had systematically erased from history. And now he was sending Jamal to demolish my home to cover his tracks. I took a slow, deep breath. The freezing panic from the morning was completely gone. I was cold, calculated, and ready to strike. Keep your $50,000, Richard, I said, my voice echoing like ice in the ruined apartment. I do not want your money. I do not want your apologies. And I absolutely do not owe you anything. Madeline, do not be foolish. He snapped, his paternal mask finally cracking to reveal the raw panic underneath. You have no money. You have no job. You cannot win this. I ended the call, cutting him off mid-sentence. I dropped the phone onto the floor. I stepped over the debris in my bedroom and walked straight into the master bathroom. Jamal's thugs had ripped the shower curtain down and emptied the medicine cabinets, but they had fundamentally underestimated my paranoia. I pulled over a small wooden step stool and climbed up, reaching toward the ceiling. A standard white metal air conditioning grate covered the ventilation duct directly above the shower. I pulled a coin from my pocket and wedged it into the slotted screws, twisting them rapidly. The metal grate popped free, dropping into my waiting hand. I reached deep into the dark, dusty aluminum ductwork. My fingers brushed against a thick strip of industrial duct tape. I gripped the edge and pulled hard. A heavy, watertight black bag came loose, sliding smoothly out of the ventilation shaft. I stepped down and unzipped the heavy waterproof casing. Inside rested a pristine, fully charged, encrypted backup laptop. It was completely disconnected from the Bancroft Holdings server network, entirely invisible to Jamal's digital sweep. Jamal had searched for physical ledgers. He had searched for printed proof. He had completely failed to realize that I did not need to steal files from the corporate servers to destroy them. I already had the absolute override code safely buried in the walls. I flipped open the laptop screen, the bright white light illuminating the dark, destroyed bathroom. The war had officially begun. The crisp white light of the high-definition display cast harsh shadows against the cracked ceramic tiles of the bathroom wall. I settled onto the cold floor, crossing my legs and pulling the heavy, reinforced chassis of the backup machine onto my lap. The operating system did not boot with a familiar corporate logo. It launched into a raw, text-based command terminal. I had custom-built this interface from scratch 3 years ago, stripping away every unnecessary application to create an impenetrable offline fortress. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began to type. I entered a cascading sequence of complex cryptographic passphrases, my muscle memory taking over completely. The machine hummed to life, the internal cooling fans kicking on with a low, steady whisper. I initiated a decentralized virtual private network, routing my IP address through encrypted servers in Zurich, Reykjavik, and Sao Paulo, before finally connecting to the local Chicago grid. Jamal was undoubtedly monitoring my known internet traffic. If I was going to launch a digital counteroffensive, I had to be an absolute ghost. Once the secure connection was established, I opened a heavily encrypted sandbox environment and navigated to an independent server hosting my professional correspondence. When Richard and Jamal revoked my corporate access this morning, they had instantly locked me out of the Bancroft Holdings internal communications. But my professional accounting certifications, my federal auditing licenses, and my primary industry contacts were routed through a private alias network. It was the hub of my entire professional existence. The inbox loaded with the sharp chime. It was completely flooded. I had over 200 unread messages, all received within the last 90 minutes. I clicked on the topmost email. It was a forwarded message from a senior partner at a rival forensic auditing firm, a woman I had collaborated with on several federal compliance summits. Her forward contained no personal message, just a single glaring red flag attached to a corporate mass broadcast. I scrolled down to read the original sender. The broadcast originated directly from the desk of the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of Bancroft Holdings, Jamal. He had not just fired me. He had weaponized his newly minted executive authority to initiate a total scorched earth campaign against my reputation. He had sent the mass broadcast to the executive board of every major financial institution in the country. The recipient list included the Big Four accounting firms, elite private wealth management auditors, federal regulatory contractors, and every corporate headhunter in the financial district. He had blanketed the entire industry. I read the body of the email, my eyes scanning the meticulously crafted lies. Jamal had drafted a formal, highly confidential advisory notice. He falsely claimed that effective immediately, Madeline Bancroft had been terminated for severe systematic breaches of fiduciary duty. He stated that a preliminary internal audit had uncovered millions of dollars in unexplainable discrepancies tied directly to my authorization codes. He did not stop at vague accusations. He had attached fabricated ledger logs. He had doctored the metadata on my old audit files to make it appear as though I had been quietly siphoning corporate revenue into offshore shell accounts for the past 3 years. He concluded the email by stating that Bancroft Holdings was actively cooperating with federal authorities and strongly advised all industry partners to consider me a severe flight risk and a dangerous liability. It was a flawlessly executed career assassination. The forensic accounting world was an incredibly insular, trust-based network. A formal accusation of embezzlement from a billion-dollar tech conglomerate was a permanent death sentence. Jamal was ensuring that I could never touch a corporate ledger again. He wanted me radioactive. He wanted me starved of resources, unemployable, and desperate enough to accept Richard's pathetic $50,000 hush money. I stared at the screen, reading the fabricated allegations a second time. The old Madeline, the dutiful foster daughter desperate for Richard's approval, would have been completely destroyed by this. She would have hyperventilated on the bathroom floor, crippled by the sheer injustice of the lies. She would have spent the next decade fighting in court just to clear her name, bankrupting herself in the process. But the old Madeline was gone. I closed the email client. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear sense of purpose. Jamal believed he had taken my career. He failed to realize that a career in corporate America was completely irrelevant when you owned the intellectual property of the entire sector. He was playing a petty game of office politics while I held the keys to the kingdom. I closed the browser and opened a blank command terminal. If Jamal wanted to play dirty, I was going to show him what a real digital execution looked like. I cracked my knuckles and began to code. When I first designed the foundational compliance network for Bancroft Holdings 6 years ago, I knew exactly who I was working for. I knew Richard's paranoia and his relentless need for absolute control. I knew that one day he might attempt to lock me out of the very systems I had built to protect him. So I took precautions. I embedded a ghost protocol. It was a deeply buried, totally dormant backdoor access point, completely isolated from the primary corporate servers. It did not exist on any schematic. It did not register on any firewall sweep. It was a digital phantom waiting for a specific numeric heartbeat to wake it up. I typed a string of administrative commands instructing my laptop to broadcast that exact heartbeat. I targeted the tertiary cooling system servers in the basement of the Bancroft skyscraper, a low-level utility network that no security contractor would ever bother to monitor. The terminal screen remained black for 10 agonizing seconds. I held my breath listening to the rain hammer against my broken living room window. Then a single line of bright green text flashed across the black screen. Connection established, awaiting input. A fierce, predatory smile spread across my face. Jamal thought his newly installed executive firewalls were impenetrable. He had no idea I was already walking underneath them. I routed my connection through the cooling system, bypassing the main security gates entirely, and slipped silently into the central nervous system of the Bancroft corporate network. I had complete unrestricted administrative access. I was inside. The cursor blinked steadily against the stark black background of my terminal, a tiny pulsing beacon of absolute access. I did not waste a single second celebrating. I immediately bypassed the outward-facing employee directories and dove straight into the restricted executive partitions. Jamal had spent the last 24 hours building walls to keep external threats out, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of the house. I was not breaking in. I was the architect walking through the foundation. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I executed a silent data siphon, a script I had written years ago for emergency internal audits. It bypassed standard user authentication by mimicking automated system maintenance protocols. Within seconds, I bypassed Jamal's newly minted Chief Operating Officer credentials and breached his private communication servers. I mirrored the connection to include Isabella's executive accounts, syncing their private network traffic directly to my localized encrypted drive. I opened the mirrored inbox and began to sift through the digital debris. They were sloppy. They were operating with the reckless, arrogant invincibility of thieves who believed they had successfully eliminated the only witness. Instead of using secure offline channels, Jamal and Isabella had been openly discussing the mechanics of their corporate coup over standard internal chat clients and supposedly encrypted executive emails. I initiated a rapid text search filtering for recent attachments, legal drafts, and high-volume financial ledgers. A specific thread caught my eye. It was an ongoing exchange between Jamal Richard and a team of external acquisition lawyers representing a Silicon Valley titan known as Aegis Global. The subject line was simply labeled, Project Apex Final. I opened the thread. The sheer scale of their ambition and their delusion unfolded before me in stark white text. Aegis Global was not just investing in Bancroft Holdings. They were executing a complete aggressive buyout. The final acquisition price was staggering, $200 million. It was an all-cash transaction designed to close rapidly before the end of the fiscal quarter. Jamal had been pushing the Aegis executives for an expedited signature timeline, citing fabricated competing offers to create a false sense of urgency. The final closing call was scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in the Bancroft executive boardroom. I downloaded the attached letter of intent and the finalized asset purchase agreement. I opened the PDF, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the practiced efficiency of a senior forensic auditor. I scrolled past the indemnification clauses and the standard non-compete agreements, hunting for the specific inventory of the sale. I found it on page 47. Schedule A, the Intellectual Property Manifest. My heart hammered a slow, rhythmic beat against my ribs as I read the itemized list. There it was, paragraph after paragraph detailing the transfer of the core federal compliance algorithms, the proprietary encryption keys, the foundational source code that governed the global financial networks. Richard and Jamal were officially legally transferring the ownership of those exact assets to Aegis Global in exchange for $200 million. I leaned back against the cold ceramic tiles of my bathroom wall, a sharp, disbelieving exhale escaping my lips. It was the ultimate fatal flaw. They were attempting to sell an empire they did not legally possess. Every single line of code, every algorithm, and every patent listed on that manifest belonged exclusively to Vanguard Apex Holdings. It belonged to me. The blind trust had dissolved, and the title transfer was already executing across secure federal databases. Aegis Global was preparing to wire $200 million to Richard Bancroft for the digital equivalent of thin air. But the sheer audacity of the IP theft was only the beginning. As a forensic accountant, I knew that a $200 million valuation did not materialize from thin air. Aegis Global would have demanded exhaustive due diligence. They would have required irrefutable proof of Bancroft Holdings' revenue streams, profit margins, and liability risks. I pivoted my search, diving deeper into Jamal's specific user directory. I needed to see exactly what financial metrics he had provided to the Aegis acquisition team. I located a locked compressed folder labeled Aegis Due Diligence Finals. I shattered the weak encryption hash in less than 30 seconds and extracted the contents. Dozens of dense, complex Excel spreadsheets flooded my screen. I opened the master valuation ledger. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the rot. Jamal had not just tweaked the numbers. He had completely fabricated an alternate financial reality. I cross-referenced the spreadsheets he had sent to Aegis with the raw, unadulterated server data I was pulling directly from the Bancroft mainframe. The discrepancies were massive and blindingly obvious to anyone who knew where to look. Jamal had artificially inflated their user retention metrics by 30%. He had completely scrubbed a massive looming liability column detailing impending federal fines for data mishandling. He had invented phantom revenue streams from overseas shell clients to artificially boost their quarterly profit margins. He had systematically cooked the books to justify the astronomical $200 million price tag. He had built a fortress of lies, and Richard had blindly signed his name to every single page of it. I highlighted the doctored spreadsheets, the fraudulent asset purchase agreement, and the chat logs where Jamal and Isabella openly discussed hiding the liability columns from the Aegis auditors. I hit a single keystroke, executing a mass data extraction. Megabyte after megabyte of irrefutable damning evidence flowed through my localized network, copying directly onto my encrypted offline hard drive. I watched the progress bar inch toward 100%. The blue light of the monitor reflected in the dark, shattered remnants of my apartment. They had not just fired me. They had not just stolen my mother's legacy. By transmitting these explicitly fabricated financial documents across state lines to a corporate buyer, and by attempting to sell intellectual property, they did not legally own Richard, and Jamal had officially crossed the Rubicon. They had just committed textbook multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. The progress bar chimed softly, hitting completion. The data was mine. I safely disconnected the Ghost protocol, wiping my digital footprints from the cooling servers, and sealed the back door behind me. I was a ghost once more. I slowly lowered the laptop screen. A cold, razor-sharp smile broke across my face in the darkness. They wanted to finalize their perfect corporate buyout at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I was going to make absolutely certain I had a front-row seat. But before the sun rose on their corporate execution, I had one final piece of necessary theater to perform tonight. I needed them arrogant. I needed them completely intoxicated by their own perceived invincibility, entirely convinced that I was a broken, defeated obstacle they had successfully crushed. To guarantee they walked blindly into the slaughter tomorrow morning, I had to bait them into publicly declaring their victory. The stage was already set. Tonight was the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's annual winter fundraising gala, a mandatory high society event for the city's financial elite. The entire Bancroft family would be there holding court and projecting an image of untouchable corporate royalty. Getting inside a highly secured invite-only gala for billionaires was notoriously difficult, especially for a newly blacklisted unemployed accountant. Fortunately, I had a favor waiting to be cashed in. 2 years ago, I conducted a private, highly discreet forensic audit for a retired hedge fund manager named Marcus Thorne. I untangled a massive web of offshore accounts his former business partner had attempted to conceal, saving Marcus tens of millions of dollars in federal penalties. He owed me. I called his private number, explained I needed a secure +1 entry under a fake name, and he delivered within 10 minutes. I stood in the humid, dimly lit bathroom of my destroyed apartment and prepared my disguise. I could not walk into that gala looking like the meticulous, calculated auditor they feared. I had to look like the collateral damage they believed they had created. I pulled a plain, slightly faded black dress from the chaotic pile of clothes Jamal's thugs had left on my bedroom floor. I threw a wrinkled tan trench coat over it. I deliberately smudged my mascara, leaving dark, frantic shadows under my eyes. I ran my hands through my hair, pulling it out of its usual tight professional bun until it hung in messy, uneven strands around my face. I looked exactly like a woman who had just lost her mind. I took a city cab to the Grand Symphony Hall, stepping out into the freezing wind. I bypassed the red carpet press line, slipped my forged digital ticket to the private security detail at the side entrance, and stepped into the sprawling, opulent ballroom. The contrast between my reality and their world was instantly staggering. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars bathed the room in warm golden light. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the crowd with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the hushed conversations of the city's wealthiest power brokers. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, keeping my head down, scanning the room for my targets. It took me less than 3 minutes to find them. They were stationed near the base of the sweeping marble staircase, commanding the attention of everyone around them. They were practically vibrating with premature victory. Caroline wore a floor-length emerald gown and a diamond necklace that likely cost more than the entire operating budget of my former department. Richard stood tall in a custom-tailored tuxedo, swirling a glass of scotch and laughing expansively at a joke Jamal had just delivered. Jamal looked incredibly smug, wearing his newly minted Chief Operating Officer title like a crown, while Isabella clung tightly to his arm, surveying the room with pure, unadulterated elitism. They were celebrating. They were toasting to the $200 million they believed was already sitting in their bank accounts. I took a deep, steadying breath. I forced my shoulders to slump. I made my breathing erratic and shallow. I channeled every ounce of the terror I had felt this morning and weaponized it into pure, unfiltered desperation. I marched directly into the center of their circle. "Richard, please," I said, making my voice loud enough to slice right through the polite hum of the gala and the music of the string quartet. The laughter died instantly. The wealthy socialites standing nearby turned their heads, their eyes wide with sudden predatory curiosity. Richard's face hardened into a mask of absolute disgust. He looked me up and down, his eyes taking in my wrinkled coat and smudged makeup. Caroline physically recoiled, clutching her diamond necklace and letting out a sharp, dramatic gasp as if my very presence was a biological contagion. "What in God's name are you doing here, Madeline?" Richard demanded, his voice a low, furious hiss. "You are making a scene. Leave immediately before I have security throw you out into the street." I ignored his threat, pitching my voice higher, letting it crack with manufactured panic. "Please, I just need to talk to you. I have nothing. Jamal sent that email to the entire industry. I am blacklisted. My apartment was destroyed. You took my credentials, you took my accounts, you took everything." Isabella let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Look at you," she sneered, her eyes raking over my disheveled appearance. "You look like a complete lunatic. We always knew you did not belong in our world, Madeline. You were just a stray dog my father took pity on. This is exactly where you belong, begging." I turned to Richard, forcing tears to well up in my eyes, letting them spill down my cheeks to ruin my makeup even further. "I will do anything," I pleaded loudly, ensuring the growing crowd of onlookers heard every single word. "I will take a demotion. I will work in the mailroom. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreement you want. Just please give me my job back. You cannot just erase me." Jamal stepped forward, placing himself between me and Richard. The raw, arrogant power in his eyes was blinding. He relished this. He thrived on the public display of his absolute dominance. "We did not just erase you, Madeline," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We fundamentally upgraded the company. You were a liability, a stubborn relic holding Bancroft Holdings back from its true potential. We are streamlining operations. Tomorrow morning, Richard and I are cementing a legacy that you could never even comprehend. You are entirely obsolete." But I built the compliance network, I sobbed, shrinking back as if terrified by his presence. I kept this family safe. You kept us chained to your paranoid regulations, Jamal shot back, stepping closer, fully taking the bait. I am the chief operating officer now. I control the network, I control the data, and I control the narrative. That blacklist email was just a courtesy warning to the industry. You have no leverage, you have no proof, you have absolutely nothing. Richard adjusted his cuffs, looking at me with cold, dead eyes. You brought this on yourself, Madeline. You refused to adapt. You refused to recognize the brilliant restructuring Jamal and Isabella have put together. By tomorrow, Bancroft Holdings will be playing in a league you cannot even fathom. Now get out of my sight before I have you arrested for trespassing. I let out a pathetic, broken whimper. I looked at their faces, Caroline's sneering disgust, Isabella's triumphant cruelty, Richard's cold dismissal, Jamal's blinding, reckless arrogance. They had swallowed the performance entirely. They truly believed I was a shattered, helpless victim begging for scraps at their table. They had publicly claimed responsibility for my destruction and proudly announced their total control over the corporate structure just hours before they intended to commit massive federal fraud. I lowered my head, hiding the razor-sharp smile that fought to break across my face. I am sorry, I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. I am so sorry. I turned and fled through the crowd of whispering socialites rushing toward the grand exit doors. I burst out into the freezing Chicago night, the icy wind hitting my face. I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks and pulled my coat tight against the cold. The theater was over. The bait was taken. They were completely blind to the trap closing around them. I hailed a passing cab and gave the driver the address to my backup location. It was time to prepare the execution. Before the cab driver could shift the vehicle into gear, a sharp, violent rap on the rear passenger glass shattered the quiet interior. I flinched, turning toward the rain-streaked window. Jamal stood on the wet pavement, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Just a few feet behind him, safely shielded from the weather under the grand illuminated awning of the Symphony Hall, stood Isabella and Caroline. They had followed me out. The public humiliation inside the ballroom had not been enough to satiate their endless parasitic appetite for cruelty. They wanted to witness my absolute destruction. Jamal gripped the handle and yanked the heavy cab door open, letting the biting Chicago wind howl into the back seat. Did you honestly think you could just scurry off into the night without a proper farewell? Madeline, Isabella called out from the warmth of the entryway. She clutched a sleek mink wrap around her shoulders, her lips twisted into a grotesque, triumphant sneer. Look at her mother. It is truly pathetic. She looks like a drowned rat. Caroline let out a dry, humorless chuckle, her eyes raking over my deliberately wrinkled trench coat and the smeared mascara staining my cheeks. I always told Richard it was a mistake to bring her into our home. Caroline stated, her voice projecting clearly over the sound of the idling taxi engine. You can dress up a charity case, you can pay for their education, but they always carry the stench of the foster system with them. She is exactly where she belongs, back in the gutter. I pressed myself deep into the cracked vinyl of the taxi seat, pulling my knees toward my chest. I forced my hands to tremble visibly. I let my jaw quiver, burying my face in the collar of my damp coat. Please, I whimpered, making sure my voice cracked with raw, unadulterated fear. Just leave me alone. You have taken everything. I have nothing left to give you. My display of total submission was intoxicating to them. I could see it in the way Jamal's posture shifted, his shoulders squaring as he absorbed my fabricated terror. Narcissists are inherently predictable. They cannot resist gloating when they believe they have achieved absolute victory. He leaned heavily into the open doorframe of the cab, bringing his face mere inches from mine. He smelled of expensive single malt scotch, imported cologne, and blinding arrogance. You really thought you could outsmart us? Jamal whispered, his voice a low, lethal hum designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. You thought those little compliance algorithms made you untouchable. But you are nothing, Madeline. You are a glorified calculator. Tomorrow morning, we are closing a deal that will rewrite the financial hierarchy of this entire city. I kept my eyes locked on the floor mats, letting out a soft, broken sob. Jamal could not help himself. The secret was burning a hole in his ego. He needed me to know the exact magnitude of my defeat. He leaned in even closer, the heat of his breath brushing against my ear. $200 million, Madeline Jamal whispered, savoring every single syllable. Aegis Global. They are buying the entire tech division. They are buying your code, your networks, and your entire legacy. And Richard is handing me the keys to the kingdom. Aegis Global. He had said the name out loud. He had verbally explicitly confirmed the buyer and the fraudulent transaction to my face. The circle of evidence was now flawlessly complete. I looked up at him, widening my eyes in a mask of perfect, devastated shock. Aegis. I gasped, letting my voice waver. But you cannot. The federal audits. We own the audits now, Jamal interrupted, his smile sharp and predatory. We own everything. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He withdrew a thick, heavy envelope. It was crafted from premium textured cardstock and sealed with a custom wax stamp. He held it up under the harsh glow of the streetlights. It was a VIP access pass, a highly restricted, encoded invitation to the private executive boardroom for the closing ceremony tomorrow morning. I watched his fingers grip the edge of the envelope. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it carelessly. The heavy envelope hit my chest and fluttered down onto the damp, dirty floor mat of the taxi. Come watch the real bloodline make history. Jamal sneered, his eyes entirely devoid of humanity. Or stay in your miserable little apartment and rot. It makes absolutely no difference to us. He slammed the cab door shut with a deafening crack. I stayed completely frozen in my cowering position. I watched through the rain-slicked window as Jamal turned his back on the cab, adjusting his cuffs with practiced elegance. He walked back under the grand awning, joining Isabella and Caroline. The three of them shared a final victorious laugh, their silhouettes framed by the golden light of the symphony hall, before they turned and disappeared back into the opulent warmth of the gala. The moment the heavy brass doors swung shut behind them, the trembling in my hands ceased instantly. The manufactured terror evaporated from my chest, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. I sat up perfectly straight against the vinyl seat. I reached down and picked up the heavy gold foil envelope from the floor mat. I ran my thumb over the embossed lettering of the Bancroft Holdings crest. This was not just a piece of paper. It was an encoded physical bypass key. Jamal had spent the entire day locking me out of the corporate skyscraper, revoking my digital badges, and instructing building security to deny me entry. But his own monumental ego had just handed me unrestricted, unquestioned VIP access to the executive floor. He had given me the exact weapon I needed to walk right past his armed guards tomorrow morning. "Are you all right, miss?" the cab driver asked, his voice hesitant, as he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. I looked up, meeting the driver's gaze in the reflection. I wiped the smeared mascara from my cheeks with the back of my hand. The pathetic broken girl was entirely gone. A cold, predatory smile slowly stretched across my face. "I am perfectly fine," I said, my voice ringing with absolute razor-sharp clarity. "Take me to the South Loop. I have a very important meeting to prepare for." The cab cut through the rain-swept streets of the South Loop, delivering me to my secure backup location just before midnight. I did not sleep. The adrenaline in my veins was a living, pulsing current. I spent the dark hours of the early morning meticulously compiling the data I had extracted from the Bancroft servers. I transferred the encrypted ledgers, the doctored valuation spreadsheets, and the raw intellectual property manifests onto a single titanium-encased flash drive. Alongside the digital evidence, I printed out the original unalterable trust dissolution documents and the indisputable transfer deeds, proving Vanguard Apex Holdings owned every single line of code Aegis Global was attempting to buy. By the time the sun broke over Lake Michigan, casting a cold gray light across the city, I had swapped my wrinkled trench coat for a razor-sharp charcoal blazer and tailored trousers. I strapped my mother's vintage silver watch to my wrist. I was no longer playing the victim. I was the executioner. Aegis Global was a West Coast leviathan, but their lead acquisition director, a ruthless corporate shark named Harrison Vance, operated out of a luxury penthouse in Chicago whenever he closed Midwest deals. My overnight digital sweep had yielded more than just financial data. It had given me access to Vance's highly guarded personal itinerary. Before any 9 o'clock boardroom meeting, Vance played a mandatory 6 o'clock round of golf at the ultra-exclusive Oakbrook Heritage Club. It was a billionaire's playground fortified by wrought iron gates and private security details. I arrived at the Oakbrook perimeter precisely at 6:15. I bypassed the main gate entirely, walking half a mile down the perimeter fence until I reached the service entrance used by landscaping crews and catering staff. A well-placed $100 bill and a confident stride got me past the delivery checkpoint. I marched across the dew-soaked emerald grass of the 18th hole, the morning mist still clinging to the fairways. I spotted him on the driving range. Harrison Vance stood tall in a crisp white polo shirt and slacks, gripping a titanium driver. Two massive suited private security contractors flanked his golf cart. I did not slow my pace. I walked directly onto the manicured tee box. The moment my heels clicked against the concrete path bordering the grass, the two security contractors pivoted. They moved with terrifying speed, stepping into my path and raising their hands. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," the larger of the two growled, stepping forward to physically block my trajectory. "Turn around immediately." I sidestepped his outstretched arm, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Vance. The second guard lunged his hand, gripping my shoulder with crushing force. I did not struggle. I simply raised my voice, pitching it perfectly to carry over the quiet morning air. "Project Apex Final." I shouted my words, cutting through the mist like a blade. $200 million for a Schedule AIP manifest that Bancroft Holdings does not legally own. Vance froze mid-swing. The driver hovered in the air for a fraction of a second before he slowly lowered it to the grass. He turned around, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. He evaluated me, taking in my sharp suit and the complete lack of fear on my face. "Let her go," Vance commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. The security guard instantly released my shoulder, stepping back but remaining coiled for violence. Vance tossed his club to a caddy and grabbed a towel, wiping his hands as he walked toward me. "You have exactly 60 seconds to explain how you know those classified project codenames before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." "My name is Madeline Bancroft," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of intimidation. "I am the former senior forensic auditor for Bancroft Holdings. And I am the only reason you are not about to commit your firm to a $200 million federal wire fraud investigation. We need to sit down." Vance's eyes flickered with a sudden dangerous curiosity. The name clearly registered. He gestured toward a private wrought iron patio table set back from the driving range under a canvas awning. We walked over in silence. He took a seat, crossing his arms over his chest. He was projecting absolute dominance, but the tight set of his jaw betrayed his sudden anxiety. "You are scheduled to be in the Bancroft executive boardroom in less than 2 hours to sign a final letter of intent and execute a cash transfer," I stated, placing my leather portfolio on the glass tabletop. "Richard Bancroft and Jamal have promised you an unencumbered tech division. They provided you with internal spreadsheets showing flawless profit margins, zero pending federal liabilities, and total ownership of the compliance algorithms your company desperately needs." Vance stared at me, his poker face flawless. "Bancroft provided extensive due diligence. Our internal auditors verified the data. If you are a disgruntled, terminated employee looking for a payout, you have chosen the wrong target." "Your auditors verified the data Jamal spoon-fed them," I countered smoothly. They did not look beneath the floorboards. I unzipped the leather portfolio. I withdrew the thick stack of physical certified documents I had printed just hours earlier. I slid them across the glass table. "Take a very close look at the title deed for the intellectual property listed in your Schedule A manifest." Vance scoffed, but his eyes dropped to the paperwork. He picked up the first document. It was the federal patent registration and the foundational trust dissolution papers clearly transferring all rights to Vanguard Apex Holdings. I watched as his eyes scanned the text. The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The arrogant flush of his morning workout completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "This is a holding company," Vance whispered, his voice losing all its previous power. "This IP is shielded. Bancroft Holdings is attempting to sell assets tied up in an external trust." "Not tied up," I corrected, my tone dropping to a lethal calm. "Owned. Vanguard Apex Holdings is my private company. Richard Bancroft has absolutely zero legal authority to sell you that technology. Furthermore, the financial metrics Jamal provided you are entirely fabricated. They scrubbed $30 million in looming federal compliance fines from their liability column to inflate their valuation. I placed the titanium flash drive directly on top of the legal papers. Every raw, unedited ledger proving their insolvency is on that drive." Vance stared at the drive as if it were a live grenade. The realization of the catastrophic legal liability his firm had nearly stepped into washed over him. If Aegis Global had wired that $200 million, they would have been accessories to a massive federal crime buying stolen property from fraudulent ledgers. He looked up at me, the arrogance completely erased, replaced by a cold, calculating respect. "What exactly do you want, Madeline?" he asked quietly. I smiled, the predatory grin finally unleashing itself in the morning light. "I want to walk into that 9 o'clock boardroom meeting with you. I want to walk into that 9 o'clock boardroom meeting with you." Harrison Vance leaned back, the metal legs of the patio chair scraping sharply against the concrete. His eyes darted over the printed trust documents, then back to my face. He was a man accustomed to holding all the leverage, and he did not like the sudden sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet. He glanced toward his security contractors standing 20 yards away, then looked at the titanium flash drive resting on the glass. "You want to humiliate Richard Bancroft on my time?" Vance stated, his voice a low warning rumble. "I want to save you $200 million. I corrected, my tone perfectly even. "The humiliation is just a fringe benefit." Vance snatched the flash drive from the table and stood up. "Show me. In the cart. Now." I followed him to the sleek, customized golf cart parked on the edge of the manicured fairway, safely out of earshot of the caddy and the armed guards. I slid into the passenger seat, resting my laptop on the steering wheel console. The morning mist was beginning to burn off the grass, but the air inside the cart felt charged and freezing. I inserted the drive and booted up the localized encrypted environment. Jamal thought he was clever. I began opening the master directory and bypassing the primary security hash. He knew Aegis would send a small army of forensic auditors during due diligence. So instead of trying to hide the fraudulent data within the live server, he created an entirely isolated mirror of the Bancroft network. He built a sandbox. It looked identical to the live environment, which is why your team never flagged it. They were auditing a simulation. Vance leaned in his shoulder, pressing against mine as his eyes locked onto the screen. "I pulled up the user acquisition metrics," I continued. "Here is the data Jamal fed your team. It shows a steady, aggressive month-over-month user growth of 14%. It shows a customer acquisition cost that is artificially suppressed by nearly half. It justifies the massive tech valuation he demanded." I hit a keystroke, executing a cross-reference script I had written at 2 in the morning. A second spreadsheet overlapped the first. The data columns instantly shifted from a healthy green to a bleeding catastrophic red. "And here is the raw, unadulterated server pull from midnight last night," I stated. "He inflated retention by 30%. He created phantom revenue streams using automated bots masking as overseas shell clients to hide their massive churn rate. Your $200 million valuation is based on ghosts. Bancroft Holdings hasn't acquired a legitimate new enterprise client in 6 months." Vance's breathing grew shallow. His large hands gripped the dashboard of the golf cart so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If our internal compliance missed this, if we executed this wire, Aegis would have been publicly crucified by the SEC. "It gets substantially worse," I said, my voice clinical and detached. "A phantom user base is just smoke and mirrors. This is the live ammunition." I opened a hidden, highly encrypted folder Jamal had buried beneath 4 layers of administrative firewalls. Are you familiar with the federal data protection statutes regarding centralized financial algorithms? I asked. Intimately. Vance growled, his eyes never leaving the screen. Then you know the strict penalties for non-compliance. I highlighted a massive glaring column that Jamal had entirely scrubbed from the Aegis due diligence package. Bancroft Holdings is currently facing a localized impending federal audit. The compliance algorithms they are currently operating, the exact same algorithms they do not legally own, have been failing basic security encryptions for 3 consecutive quarters. The federal fines attached to these violations are compounding daily. I pointed to the final number at the bottom of the column. $85 million, I said softly. That is the immediate non-negotiable penalty the federal government is preparing to drop on Bancroft Holdings. Jamal did not just hide a liability. He wrapped an $85 million federal bomb in a bow and tried to sell it to you as an asset. Vance stared at the screen. The sheer scale of the deception, the absolute audacity of Jamal and Richard's fraud radiated from the glowing pixels. He wasn't just about to buy a stolen company. He was about to buy a company that was actively sinking under the weight of massive hidden federal debt. If he had signed those papers at 9 o'clock, his career, and potentially his freedom, would have been destroyed. He snatched his phone from his pocket. His thumb struck the screen with a violent, precise aggression. He brought the phone to his ear, his jaw locked in fury. "Callahan!" Vance barked into the receiver, his voice tight with suppressed, lethal rage. "Kill the wire! I do not care if the bank has already initiated the clearing protocols. You pull the plug right now. Freeze everything tied to Project Apex. If a single cent leaves our accounts, I will personally see you disbarred." He listened for a fraction of a second before cutting off his own general counsel. "No, do not ask me for clarification. The deal is severely compromised. Bancroft is attempting to offload toxic assets and fabricated revenue. Lock down the legal team and prep a breach of contract suit. We are going to war." Vance ended the call, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. He turned slowly in the leather seat of the golf cart, facing me fully. The arrogant, untouchable corporate director from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a man looking at me with cold, calculated respect. "You have dismantled a $200 million acquisition in less than 10 minutes, Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You possess the foundational IP deeds. You possess the raw server data. You have Richard Bancroft and his new chief operating officer dead to rights on massive corporate fraud." He leaned back, assessing me with the eyes of a man who recognized a predator of his own caliber. "Walking into that boardroom with this data is going to cause a corporate bloodbath," Vance stated flatly. "Richard Bancroft will face immediate federal indictment. Aegis Global will publicly withdraw the offer. The fallout will destroy Bancroft Holdings by the end of the trading day." "That is the objective," I replied smoothly, shutting my laptop with a definitive click. Vance nodded slowly. "You don't just want to stop the sale. You want to execute them publicly. So tell me, Madeline, when the dust settles and Bancroft is in ruins, what exactly is your endgame? What do you want from Aegis?" "I want the acquisition to proceed," I said. Vance frowned, confusion temporarily breaking his stoic facade. "You just proved the company is a toxic, fraudulent shell." "Bancroft Holdings is a shell," I agreed. "But Vanguard Apex Holdings is not. The compliance algorithms work. The technology is flawless. It was simply being mismanaged by thieves." I looked directly into his eyes, holding his gaze. "Aegis Global needs that technology. You need the security infrastructure I built. When Richard Bancroft is removed in handcuffs, Bancroft Holdings will face immediate liquidation. I am offering you a direct, clean partnership with Vanguard Apex. You get the technology you actually wanted, completely free of fraudulent liabilities, at a fraction of the cost you were prepared to pay today." A slow, predatory smile mirrored my own on Vance's face. The genius of the play was impossible for him to ignore. He wouldn't just save his firm from a catastrophic disaster. He would secure the vital technology and look like a corporate savior to his board of directors. Vance extended his hand across the center console of the golf cart. 9 o'clock, Vance said, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. We walk in together. No, I replied, my voice slicing through his eager momentum. Walking into a private soundproof boardroom at 9 o'clock is a quiet execution. They would panic, call their lawyers, and settle out of court under the veil of heavily enforced non-disclosure agreements. I do not want a quiet execution, Harrison. I want a public crucifixion. Vance slowly lowered his hand, resting it on the steering wheel of the golf cart. The thrill of the immediate kill faded from his eyes, replaced by a deep, analytical curiosity. I am listening. Bancroft Holdings is hosting their official merger gala this Saturday night, I explained, leaning back against the leather seat. It is the absolute crown jewel of their social calendar. They have invited the city's financial elite, industry regulators, and the tech press to witness the dawn of their new empire. Richard and Jamal want to bask in the glory of a $200 million acquisition. We are going to give them exactly the spotlight they are begging for. Vance's gaze sharpened. You want to execute the final signatures at the gala. I want you to weaponize their vanity, I said. When you walk into that boardroom at 9 o'clock this morning, you will smile. You will shake their hands. You will act completely thrilled with their fraudulent due diligence. But you will not sign the final asset purchase agreement. You will tell Jamal that a deal of this magnitude deserves a theatrical close. You will insist that the final irrevocable signatures be executed publicly on Saturday night on stage, in front of the flashing cameras. And what exactly will they be signing? Vance asked, his voice dropping to a low rumble. Because my legal department is not going to authorize a public stunt with a fraudulent company without absolute ironclad protection. I reached back into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, bound manuscript. The cover page was practically identical to the standard Aegis Global acquisition contract Jamal had been circulating, but the contents were radically, fatally different. They will not be signing your contract, I stated, dropping the heavy manuscript onto Vance's lap. They will be signing this. Vance opened the cover, his eyes scanning the dense legal boilerplate. What is this? A masterpiece, I replied. Drafted last night by Elias Kent, my personal corporate attorney. Elias is a shark who specializes in hostile takeovers and punitive contract law. He took Jamal's finalized asset purchase agreement and performed a surgical reconstruction. I reached over and flipped to page 47. Jamal and Richard are notoriously arrogant. I explained, tracking my finger down the margins. Jamal believes he is the smartest man in any room, and Richard signs whatever Jamal puts in front of him. They will be so blinded by the champagne, the applause, and the presence of the press that they will not bother to review a 90-page document they believe was finalized days ago. Vance read the highlighted clauses, his eyes widening with every line. Elias had gutted the indemnification section. He had rewritten the intellectual property transfer protocols entirely. Hidden beneath layers of dense, impenetrable legal jargon was a lethal trap. The contract explicitly stated that the signatories fully acknowledged the fabricated nature of the Schedule A manifest. It legally bound them to the admission that they were attempting to sell proprietary algorithms that belonged exclusively to Vanguard Apex Holdings. It was not a transfer of wealth. It was a legally binding, irrevocable confession of multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate insolvency. But Elias had not stopped there. The penalty clause for this admitted fraud was absolute. By signing the document, Richard and Jamal agreed to forfeit all remaining legitimate assets, liquid capital, and physical properties of Bancroft Holdings directly to Vanguard Apex as immediate, undisputed restitution. If they sign this on stage, Vance whispered, staring at the pages in pure disbelief, they aren't selling their company to Aegis. They are confessing to federal crimes and signing their entire empire over to you. Exactly, I said smoothly. And because they will be signing it under the assumption that it is the Aegis acquisition contract, the intent to commit wire fraud is finalized the moment their ink hits the paper. Vance closed the manuscript. He looked at me, a mixture of awe and genuine apprehension written across his face. You are turning my acquisition team into a Trojan horse. I am offering Aegis Global the greatest public relations victory of the decade, I countered. When the trap snaps shut, your firm will not look like the victim of a scam. You will look like the apex predators who uncovered a massive industry fraud and partnered with the true innovator to save the market. Aegis gets clean, undisputed access to my compliance algorithms through Vanguard Apex, and you personally get the credit for orchestrating the takedown of a corrupt competitor. The wind howled across the manicured golf course, rattling the canvas awning above us. Vance remained silent, weighing the immense catastrophic risks against the unparalleled rewards. The corporate world was driven by blood and optics. I was handing him a victory soaked in both. Your legal team will need to manage the binder swap. I instructed, laying out the final mechanics of the sting operation. Jamal will bring his own copies to the gala. Your general counsel will intercept them just before the ceremony, claiming Aegis requires the signatures to be executed on our official company watermarked paper. You hand Jamal Elias's contract. He signs his own death warrant on live television. Vance slowly ran a hand over his jaw. A dark, terrifying amusement danced in his eyes. He realized the sheer, flawless brutality of the setup. Jamal and Isabella had built a fortress of arrogance, and I was using that exact arrogance to burn them to the ground. Madeline, Vance said, his voice carrying a newfound reverence, remind me to never under any circumstances end up on the wrong side of your audit. Just execute the play, Harrison, I replied. Vance nodded. He extended his large, calloused hand across the space between us. There was no hesitation this time, no corporate posturing. It was an acknowledgement of absolute ruthless synergy. I reached out and gripped his hand. We shook on it. The Shadow Alliance was forged. The terms were dictated. The trap was perfectly set. Tomorrow morning, Richard and Jamal would get their handshake and their false sense of invincibility. But come Saturday night, under the blinding flash of the press cameras, they were going to lose everything. Saturday night arrived with the glittering, suffocating excess that only a billion-dollar corporate merger could justify. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel had been transformed into a sprawling monument to Bancroft Holdings. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids and silver branches flanked the grand entrance, their heavy perfume masking the scent of greed. Flashbulbs from the financial press corps erupted in a continuous blinding strobe light, casting harsh, frenetic shadows across the velvet-draped walls. Waiters in pristine livery wove seamlessly through the dense throng of industry titans, venture capitalists, and federal regulators, carrying silver trays stacked high with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. At the center of it all, standing on a slightly elevated dais, reserved exclusively for the executive board, were Richard, Caroline, Jamal, and Isabella. They looked like untouchable royalty drinking in the flashing cameras and the fawning congratulations of their peers. Jamal, poured into a pristine, bespoke tuxedo, was practically glowing with radioactive arrogance. He was playing the conquering hero flawlessly, shaking hands and loudly accepting praise for orchestrating the corporate deal of the decade. Isabella clung to his arm, projecting the image of the perfect, powerful heiress. I did not slip in through a side door tonight. I did not hide in a wrinkled trench coat, and I did not smudge my makeup to play the broken, hysterical victim. I walked straight through the massive gilded front doors, letting the heavy oak swing shut behind me with a resonant final thud. I wore a floor-length backless gown of midnight blue silk. It draped flawlessly, armor woven from pure, unadulterated confidence. My hair, previously tied in a severe, invisible bun or left in disheveled strands to feign madness, cascaded over one shoulder in perfect dark waves. I wore absolutely no jewelry, no distracting diamonds, no pearls, no corporate badges. I did not need them. I radiated absolute terrifying power. I walked with the slow, measured, and devastating cadence of a predator stepping calmly into a cage of unsuspecting, bloated prey. The effect was instantaneous. The crowd near the entrance parted, instinctively stepping aside, as if pushed by an invisible physical force. The loud, booming conversations of the financial elite faded into hushed, confused whispers as people turned to stare. I was a ghost crashing their coronation, a lethal anomaly, stepping directly into their carefully curated universe. It took less than 30 seconds for the disruption to ripple across the massive ballroom and reach the executive dais. Isabella saw me first. Her glass of champagne halted abruptly, hovering halfway to her mouth. The triumphant, sneering smile painted on her face cracked instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending horror. She slapped Jamal's shoulder hard, her manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket as she pointed a trembling finger through the crowd directly at me. Jamal turned. The smug satisfaction was wiped from his features so violently, it was as if he had been struck with a blunt instrument. His jaw clenched tight, a dangerous dark red flush creeping up his neck. He fundamentally misunderstood the moment. He mistook my presence for a repeat performance of my symphony hall breakdown. He thought I was a desperate, unemployed accountant who had scraped together her last pennies for a dress, coming to ruin his perfect press event with more pathetic begging. He did not see the trap. He only saw a threat to his monumental ego. He abandoned the press corps, instantly grabbing Isabella by the arm and storming down the marble steps of the dais. He snapped his fingers sharply at the head of the private security detail, a hulking man in a dark suit standing near an ice sculpture. Two more armed guards immediately fell into step behind them, forming a tight, aggressive wedge as they shoved their way through the crowd of elite guests. I stopped in the exact center of the ballroom, directly under the glow of the massive central chandelier, and waited. Madeline Jamal hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal, trembling whisper as he closed the final distance between us. He stopped 3 feet away, actively blocking my path, flanked heavily by the security guards. "What in the absolute hell is wrong with you? Do you have a death wish?" Isabella stepped out from behind him, her eyes flashing with venomous rage. "I told you she was mentally unstable, Jamal," she spat, keeping her voice low but entirely vicious. "Look at her. She spent her last dime on a dress just to sneak in here and humiliate herself again in front of our buyers. It is pitiful. You are a disease, Madeline." Jamal turned to the head of security, his voice sharp and commanding, dripping with absolute authority. "Grab her, drag her out through the kitchen service elevators right now. I do not care how much she kicks or screams. If she makes a sound, throw her in the alley and call the police. I want her arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate harassment." The two massive security guards stepped forward simultaneously, their large hands reaching out to grab my bare arms and physically rip me from the ballroom. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Jamal, maintaining a smile so incredibly cold it could shatter glass. Before the guards could lay a single finger on my skin, a deep, booming voice echoed across the marble floor, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a gunshot. "Stand down immediately!" The guards froze instantly. Jamal whipped his head around, his eyes widening. Harrison Vance stepped through the parting crowd. The lead acquisition director of Aegis Global commanded the room with effortless, terrifying gravity. He was flanked by his own elite security detail and a team of silver-haired corporate attorneys clutching heavy leather briefcases. The flashbulbs of the press corps went into an absolute frenzy at his arrival, documenting every chaotic second of the confrontation. Vance walked directly past Jamal, completely ignoring the chief operating officer's instinctively outstretched hand. He stepped up right beside me, turning to face the Bancroft family with a look of absolute, chilling authority. "Is there a problem here?" Jamal Vance asked, his voice echoing perfectly in the sudden suffocating silence of the ballroom. Jamal scrambled violently to recover his composure. His charismatic mask snapped back into place, though a heavy bead of sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Harrison, it is an honor," Jamal said, his voice overly smooth, dripping with forced camaraderie. "There is no problem at all. We are simply handling a minor security breach. This woman is a terminated, disgruntled former employee. She has been stalking the family. My men were just removing her so she does not disrupt the signing ceremony." Vance did not smile. He looked at the security guards, his gaze promising absolute professional destruction. "If your men touch her," Vance said, his tone dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register that left absolutely no room for negotiation, "I will personally ensure Aegis Global sues this hotel and your security firm into bankruptcy before sunrise." Jamal blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing in complete shock. Isabella took a hesitant step backward, her eyes darting frantically between Vance and me. "Harrison, I do not understand." Jamal stammered, the confidence rapidly bleeding out of his voice. "She is a trespasser. She has no business being here." Vance placed a large, firm hand on my shoulder. "Madeline Bancroft is not a trespasser," Vance declared, his voice ringing out clearly for the press corps and the surrounding industry titans to hear. "She is my VIP personal guest. In fact, her presence here tonight was a strict, non-negotiable condition of my attendance." The blood drained entirely from Jamal's face. He looked at me, then at Vance, his mind violently struggling to process the impossible paradigm shift. The unemployed failure he had mocked in the rain was standing shoulder to shoulder with the man holding a $200 million check. Caroline and Richard had just pushed their way through the murmuring crowd, arriving just in time to hear Vance's declaration. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning a sickly ashen gray as he stared at me. Now Vance continued, turning his attention to Richard with a razor-thin smile. "I believe we have a highly anticipated contract to sign on that stage. Shall we proceed?" The Bancroft family was paralyzed. They were trapped under the glaring lights of the press, surrounded by their wealthiest peers, completely stripped of their power to remove me. They had absolutely no choice but to nod mutely and retreat toward the stage, their minds racing with sheer, unadulterated panic as they walked blindly toward the slaughter. The orchestral arrangement shifted instantly, the background hum of strings swelling into a commanding, triumphant crescendo. The master of ceremonies, a polished local news anchor hired specifically for the optics, stepped to the microphone and announced the commencement of the official signing ceremony. A wave of applause rolled through the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom. The sea of industry titans and venture capitalists parted completely, creating a clear, illuminated runway toward the elevated stage. Harrison Vance offered me his arm. I took it, matching his measured, predatory stride as we walked directly down the center aisle. We bypassed the designated seating chart entirely. Vance's security detail carved out a space for us in the absolute front row, stepping right over the velvet ropes reserved for the Bancroft Board of Directors. We stood dead center, mere feet from the mahogany desk where the documents awaited. The heat from the massive television lighting rigs washed over my skin, blinding and intense. Richard, Caroline, Jamal, and Isabella ascended the velvet-lined stairs to the stage. They moved stiffly, the residual panic from our confrontation in the lobby still vibrating through their rigid postures. But the moment the cameras pivoted to track their movement, the instinct for corporate theater took over. They plastered on wide, blinding smiles, waving to the crowd as if they were ascending a throne. Aegis Global's general counsel, Callahan, was already waiting at the mahogany desk. He was a tall, severe man with silver hair and the clinical efficiency of an executioner. Jamal had sent his legal team ahead with the finalized Bancroft contracts, but Callahan executed the maneuver perfectly. As Jamal approached the desk, distracted by the blinding flashbulbs, Callahan smoothly slid the Bancroft binders beneath the table. In one seamless, practiced motion, he replaced them with two identical heavy leather portfolios bearing the gold foil Aegis Global watermark. The trap was laid bare under the bright lights, waiting for the ink. Richard stepped away from the desk and approached the central podium. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces. The room fell into a reverent hush. "Thank you all for being here on this historic evening," Richard began, his voice projecting the deep, comforting baritone of a seasoned patriarch. "When I founded Bancroft Holdings over 30 years ago, I started with nothing but a singular vision and an unwavering commitment to integrity. We built this company brick by brick, overcoming impossible odds to create a pillar of the financial technology sector. We did it by treating our clients like family and by adhering to the highest standards of corporate excellence." I stood in the front row, my face a mask of sculpted ice. Hearing the word integrity fall from his lips was physically nauseating. He was standing on a stage paid for by fabricated metrics, preparing to sell stolen algorithms and lecturing the room on moral fortitude. But a company cannot survive purely on its history. Richard continued, raising a hand in a grandiose gesture. "A true legacy requires an eye on the future. It requires fresh, dynamic leadership capable of taking the torch and carrying it forward into the next century." That is why this merger with Aegis Global is not just a financial transaction. It is the culmination of my life's work, and it gives me immense, indescribable pride to present the architect of our future, my daughter and the incoming Chief Executive Officer, Isabella Bancroft. The applause thundered through the ballroom. Isabella stepped forward to stand beside her father, basking in the deafening adulation. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the intense stage lights, throwing sharp prisms of color across her throat. She looked every inch the conquering heir, radiating a toxic, unearned glory. Standing slightly behind them, Jamal was practically vibrating with raw, unadulterated greed. His eyes were locked onto the heavy leather portfolios resting on the mahogany desk. He was calculating the exact moment the $200 million wire would clear his offshore accounts. He was so completely intoxicated by the proximity to massive wealth that he failed to notice the subtle differences in the document binding. He failed to see the predatory stillness of Callahan standing just inches away. Jamal was blind to everything except the money. Richard concluded his speech with a final sweeping note of gratitude and turned back toward the mahogany desk. The applause slowly faded into a tense, highly anticipated silence. The cameras shifted focus, zooming in tight on the heavy parchment and the waiting pens. Callahan stepped forward. He opened the custom leather portfolios with a crisp, snapping sound. He withdrew two solid, gold-plated Mont Blanc pens from his breast pocket, placing one beside each signature line. Richard stood on the right side of the desk. Isabella stood on the left. Before he picked up the pen, Richard looked up from the parchment. He looked straight over the edge of the stage, his gaze cutting down through the glaring lights, until he found me standing in the front row. I did not break the connection. I stood perfectly still, my arms relaxed at my sides, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. I did not offer him anger. I did not offer him the wounded, desperate expression he was so accustomed to seeing. I offered him the abyss. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of profound unease pass behind his eyes. He felt the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. He felt the wrongness in the room. Some deeply buried instinct screamed at him to walk away from the desk. But then Jamal leaned in, patting Richard heavily on the shoulder, urging him forward. The cameras flashed in a continuous blinding wave. The weight of the public spectacle, the absolute terror of backing out on live television, pushed Richard past his instincts. Isabella did not share her father's hesitation. She picked up the heavy gold pen with a dramatic, sweeping gesture. She turned her head, looking directly down at me. She sneered, her top lip curling into a look of absolute venomous triumph. In her mind, she had won. She believed she was permanently burying the unemployed failure who had dared to threaten her throne. She believed she was untouchable. Maintaining that arrogant, vicious sneer, Isabella pressed the gold nib to the heavy parchment. She confidently slashed her signature across the bottom of Elias Kent's trap, legally binding herself to massive federal fraud and the total forfeiture of her entire estate. Richard exhaled a sharp, heavy breath. He picked up his own pen. He looked at the document, entirely ignoring the block of dense, punitive legal text printed directly above the signature line. He pressed down the ink, bleeding dark and permanent, into the paper. He signed his name. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, chaotic storm, capturing the exact moment the Bancroft family permanently signed away their empire. The ink was barely dry on the heavy watermarked parchment when the atmosphere in the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom underwent a violent, invisible shift. Harrison Vance did not offer the customary celebratory handshake to Richard Bancroft. He did not turn to the crowd and raise a crystal flute of champagne. Instead, Vance stepped with measured, predatory precision directly to the center podium. He nudged Richard aside with a cold, immovable shoulder, gripping the edges of the mahogany lectern with both hands. The ballroom packed shoulder to shoulder with the city's financial elite, and a restless press corps hushed in eager anticipation. 1,000 glasses hung suspended in the air, catching the brilliant glare of the television lighting rigs, waiting for the signal to drink to the dawn of a new corporate empire. Vance leaned into the microphone. When he spoke, his voice possessed absolutely none of the warm, congratulatory cadence expected at a merger gala. It was a glacial, razor-sharp transmission that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Vance began, his deep baritone resonating through the towering speakers vibrating against the floorboards. Aegis Global arrived here tonight with the intention of finalizing a $200 million acquisition of Bancroft Holdings. We came here relying on the sanctity of corporate due diligence, on the accuracy of financial ledgers, and on the strict assurance of proprietary ownership. However, a transaction of this magnitude requires absolute unflinching transparency. Jamal frowned. A micro-expression of confusion broke through his meticulously crafted, arrogant facade. He glanced sharply at Vance, his predatory instincts suddenly flaring. Isabella lowered her chin, her triumphant smile faltering as she looked sideways at her father. Richard stood frozen at the mahogany desk, his hand still hovering inches from the gold-plated pen he had just used to sign away his future. The silence in the room deepened, thickening into something dense and suffocating. The venture capitalists in the front rows lowered their glasses, sensing the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Tonight we are not celebrating a merger," Vance announced, his voice echoing with devastating, lethal finality. "We are bearing witness to an execution. The documents Richard and Isabella Bancroft just executed on this stage are not transfer deeds to Aegis Global. They are legally binding, irrevocable confessions to massive systemic corporate fraud." Before the collective gasp of the crowd could fully materialize, the environmental ambiance of the ballroom violently ruptured. The towering 50-foot LED screens curving behind the executive stage had been projecting a sleek looping animation of the Bancroft and Aegis corporate logos. Suddenly, the displays violently glitched. A harsh, aggressive jolt of static tore through the massive screens, emitting a sharp electronic screech that pierced the air and echoed over the high-fidelity sound system. The familiar corporate graphics fractured into jagged pixels and vanished. The screens plunged into total darkness for a fraction of a second before roaring back to life with blinding intensity. A massive, imposing crest materialized in high-definition white against the pitch-black background. It was the sovereign, undeniable insignia of Vanguard Apex Holdings. Beneath the crest, giant, brutal crimson text flashed across the 50-foot screens, casting a harsh, bloody glow over the horrified faces of the executives trapped on the dais. Madeline Bancroft, sole owner. IP transfer denied. The hushed murmurs of the crowd instantly ignited into a deafening roar of absolute shock. Vance raised a single hand demanding silence, and the sheer gravitational force of his presence commanded it. "The compliance algorithms and centralized security infrastructure that Bancroft Holdings attempted to sell us do not belong to them," Vance continued, his voice ringing like a judge's gavel. "They are the exclusive, unencumbered property of Vanguard Apex Holdings, privately owned by Madeline Bancroft." Richard Bancroft and his executive team deliberately falsified user acquisition metrics, intentionally scrubbed $85 million in looming federal liabilities from their ledgers, and brazenly attempted to sell stolen intellectual property to my firm. Vance turned his head, looking directly into Richard and Jamal's panicked eyes. "By signing the document on this desk, you have officially admitted to federal wire fraud. You have confessed to intellectual property theft. And per the punitive clauses brilliantly hidden within the contract you were too arrogant to read, you have immediately forfeited all remaining legitimate assets, liquid capital, and physical properties of Bancroft Holdings directly to Vanguard Apex as immediate restitution. You do not own a company anymore, Richard. You own a crime scene." The reaction within the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The pristine, untouchable illusion of the Bancroft Gala shattered into a million jagged pieces. In the dead center of the front row, a prominent banking executive dropped his drink in pure shock. The sharp, explosive sound of crystals shattering against the polished marble floor acted as a starting pistol for the surrounding chaos. Glasses slipped from trembling fingers, shattering in a cascading wave of destruction across the venue. Isabella stared at the massive crimson text burning on the screens behind her. The reality of her utter, inescapable ruin slammed into her with the kinetic force of a freight train. The wealth, the power, the untouchable status she had violently clawed her way toward had just evaporated under the blinding flashbulbs of the national press. She let out a piercing, visceral scream. It was a jagged, ugly sound that tore from her throat entirely devoid of her usual manicured grace. She lunged forward, her hands clawing frantically at the leather portfolios on the mahogany desk, desperate to rip the signed pages to shreds, as if destroying the paper could somehow reverse the reality of her absolute demise. Jamal stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant, untouchable mastermind was reduced to a hollow, sweating shell. His perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a legal loophole, searching for anything to stop the walls from rapidly closing in on him. But the flashbulbs were relentless, firing in a continuous, blinding strobe that captured every bead of sweat, every twitch of pure, unadulterated terror on his face. The press corps was documenting the exact second his entire career in freedom ended. Richard Bancroft staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow to the sternum. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a terrifying, translucent gray under the harsh stage lights. His mouth opened and closed in silent, gasping pants, unable to draw oxygen into his tightening lungs. The empire he had built, the legacy he had just proudly boasted about minutes earlier, had been surgically dismantled and publicly incinerated by the daughter he had cast aside. He reached out blindly, his trembling hand grasping at the empty air for support that did not exist. His knees buckled under the crushing, suffocating weight of public humiliation and the certainty of an impending federal indictment. He stumbled hard, clutching his chest with both hands as his heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He fell back against the towering floral arrangements, knocking the silver branches to the floor in a chaotic cascade of ruined white orchids and shattered pride. The cacophony in the ballroom escalated from a stunned murmur into an absolute deafening roar. The collapse of Richard Bancroft into the shattered white orchids was the singular catalyst the press corps needed. The invisible barrier of decorum that usually protected the ultra-wealthy vanished in a split second. Reporters surged forward like a tidal wave, shoving aside the velvet ropes and trampling the scattered crystal shards. Flashbulbs fired with the rapid, blinding intensity of a war zone, capturing every agonizing detail of the Bancroft family's spectacular implosion. The financial elite, the very people who had been fawning over Richard and Isabella minutes prior, instinctively scrambled backward. They treated the dais like ground zero of a toxic spill, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between their own reputations and the radioactive wreckage of Bancroft Holdings. The air grew thick with the smell of spilled champagne and crushed floral arrangements. Isabella stood paralyzed at the mahogany desk, her hands still trembling over the leather portfolio that had sealed her doom. She stared out at the sea of flashing cameras, her perfectly curated image fracturing under the aggressive scrutiny. She opened her mouth to speak, to issue a command or a denial, but the sheer volume of the screaming reporters drowned out whatever desperate lie she intended to tell. Then a sound cut through the pandemonium. It was a sharp, synchronized slam of heavy metal and wood that reverberated through the cavernous space. The massive gilded front doors of the Four Seasons ballroom burst open with explosive force. Dozens of federal economic police agents flooded the room. They wore dark tactical vests, emblazoned with sharp yellow lettering, moving with a synchronized, lethal precision that instantly silenced the screaming reporters. They did not walk, they swarmed. They fanned out across the marble floor, establishing a strict perimeter and actively blocking every exit. Flanking the lead agents was Elias Kent, his expression a mask of cool, analytical satisfaction. He carried a heavy, reinforced briefcase containing the irrefutable audited evidence of the Bancroft family's systemic financial crimes. He had coordinated this exact strike down to the second, turning the merger gala into a perfectly executed federal raid. "Federal agents, nobody move." The command echoed through a bullhorn, slicing through the remaining ambient noise. The sight of the armed officers marching purposefully toward the executive dais finally shattered the paralysis gripping Jamal. His charismatic facade dissolved completely, leaving nothing but the raw, frantic panic of a trapped animal. He looked at the approaching federal agents, then at the heavy steel handcuffs clipping against their tactical belts. His mind violently rejected the reality of a prison cell. Jamal abandoned his carefully cultivated loyalty in a heartbeat. He shoved Isabella aside with brutal force, nearly knocking her to the stage floor, and bolted. He vaulted over the shattered remains of the floral arrangement, sprinting blindly toward the heavy velvet curtains concealing the kitchen service corridors. He shoved violently past Caroline, who had just managed to reach the stage to check on Richard. He did not make it 10 feet. 3 federal agents moved with terrifying speed, intercepting his flight path. The lead agent tackled Jamal with a bone-rattling impact. The chief operating officer of Bancroft Holdings hit the polished hardwood stage with a sickening thud, the wind violently knocked from his lungs. Jamal scrambled, kicking and thrashing wildly in a pathetic display of resistance, but the agents were merciless. A heavy knee dropped onto his spine, pinning him flat against the floorboards. The harsh metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs snapping around Jamal's wrists echoed sharply through the sudden shocked silence of the ballroom. "Get off me! Do you know who I am?" Jamal shrieked, his voice cracking into a high hysterical pitch, his cheek pressed forcefully into the stage. "I am a victim here. I did not sign that document." Jamal Williams, the arresting officer, stated, his voice a cold, clinical drone that carried perfectly across the room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, mass embezzlement, and the illicit fencing of stolen intellectual property. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sound of the Miranda rights being read on their own stage acted as a psychic shockwave. Caroline Bancroft let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. The elegant, stoic matriarch completely unraveled, dropping to her knees beside Richard, her hands pulling frantically at her own hair. "No, no, this is a mistake. Stop it!" Caroline screamed, her voice shrill and jagged as she clawed at the air. "Richard, tell them to stop. Tell them who we are." But Richard could do nothing. He remained slumped against the podium, clutching his chest, his eyes wide and vacant, as he watched his empire burn. 2 more agents flanked the mahogany desk, boxing Isabella in completely. She backed away from the gold-plated pen as if it were a venomous snake, raising her trembling hands in the air. The arrogant sneer she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed, hyperventilating terror of a woman realizing her entire existence had been a fraud. Isabella Bancroft, the lead agent, announced, snapping a second pair of handcuffs securely around her wrists, binding her hands in front of her ruined diamond necklace. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud federal regulators. You have the right to an attorney." As the agents hauled Isabella and Jamal to their feet, parading them in steel chains before the relentless onslaught of the press cameras, I finally moved. I stepped away from Harrison Vance and slowly walked toward the stage. I placed my hand on the velvet banister and ascended the stairs with a slow, deliberate cadence. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the midnight blue silk of my gown trail over the very steps my family had used to ascend to their false throne. I stopped at the absolute edge of the dais, standing directly in front of the flashing crimson screens that declared my total ownership of their stolen legacy. I looked down at the wreckage. I looked at Jamal. His bespoke tuxedo ruined, his face twisted in humiliated fury as agents dragged him toward the exit. I looked at Isabella, openly weeping, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face as she struggled against the federal restraints. I looked at Caroline, sobbing hysterically on the floor, and finally I looked at Richard. Richard met my gaze from his crumpled position on the floorboards. The absolute terror in his eyes finally gave way to understanding. He saw the predator standing over the prey. He realized in the final agonizing moments of his freedom that I had not just defeated him. I had meticulously, perfectly orchestrated his total and permanent annihilation. I stood above them, silent and immovable, watching their entire world burn to ash. 1 month later, the chaotic, blinding aftermath of the Four Seasons Gala had finally settled into the quiet, clinical efficiency of a hostile corporate takeover. The federal indictments had come down with terrifying, unprecedented speed, freezing every Bancroft account, seizing every property, and shattering their legacy into unrecognizable fragments. I did not watch the daily news coverage of their bail hearings. I did not care about the tabloid speculations or the endless financial podcasts dissecting their monumental collapse. I was entirely too busy absorbing the empire they had forfeit. The top floor of the Bancroft Holdings Tower, once a heavily guarded fortress built to keep me out, now belonged entirely to Vanguard Apex. It belonged to me. I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in the exact center of the Chief Executive Officer suite. The room felt fundamentally different now. The suffocating, stagnant air of Richard's monumental ego had been scrubbed clean. I had ordered the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes removed, allowing the harsh, unfiltered morning light to stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows and illuminate every corner of the vast space. The antique oil paintings, the framed magazine covers, and the gaudy golf trophies that once lined the walls were completely gone, leaving behind a stark, minimalist aesthetic of pure, unadulterated function. I wore a tailored charcoal suit perfectly pressed, my posture relaxed but commanding. I was no longer the discarded daughter fighting for scraps in the shadows. I was the apex predator sitting comfortably at the top of the food chain, waiting patiently for the final piece of the past to be cleared away. The heavy oak double doors swung open, breaking the absolute silence of the room. Two massive security guards in dark suits stepped through the threshold, parting to reveal the man who used to own this building. Richard Bancroft was entirely unrecognizable. The imposing, terrifying patriarch, who had ruthlessly banished me from his life, had been replaced by a hollowed-out shell. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit that seemed 3 sizes too big, the expensive fabric hanging limply off his suddenly frail frame. His skin was a sallow, sickly gray under the bright office lights, and his hands trembled violently as he clutched a single pathetic cardboard box. It was the standard-issue banker's box given to terminated employees to gather their desk supplies, a stark, deliberate reminder of the exact indignity he had forced upon me. He shuffled forward, his eyes darting nervously around the stripped office, before finally landing on me, sitting behind his former desk. "Madeline," he rasped, his voice a dry, broken wheeze. The moment he spoke, the last fragile barrier of his pride collapsed completely. Tears spilled over his lower lids, tracking through the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. He stumbled closer entirely, ignoring the security guards flanking him. "Madeline, please, you have to listen to me. I was blind. I was foolish." He placed the cardboard box on the floor as if the weight of it was too much to bear, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk with shaking fingers. "You have to believe me. I never wanted it to go this far. It was Caroline. She poisoned my mind against you. She and Jamal, they manipulated the numbers, they fed me lies about your incompetence to protect Isabella. They used my love for family to blind me to what was really happening. I am your father, Maddie. I built this for you. I was just trying to protect the legacy. Please, I have absolutely nothing left. The federal government seized the accounts. The bank is foreclosing on the house. Jamal is looking at 20 years and Isabella is refusing to speak to me. You have your company now. You won. Just give me a fraction of my shares back. Just enough to survive. I am begging you." I did not move. I did not offer him a tissue, and I certainly did not offer him absolution. I let his pathetic, desperate sobs echo in the quiet office for a long, agonizing moment before I finally spoke. "Stop." My voice was a blade of absolute ice, instantly cutting through his hysterical rambling. He flinched violently, his mouth snapping shut. "You do not get to rewrite history because you lost Richard. You were not manipulated. You were not a tragic victim of Caroline's scheming or Jamal's greed. You embraced them because they offered you a comfortable lie instead of a difficult truth. You threw me out into the pouring rain. You stripped me of my position, my dignity, and my future, because I threatened the delicate illusion of your perfect genetically mandated hierarchy. You looked me dead in the eyes and you actively chose your true blood over the person who actually built your wealth. Loyalty is earned, Richard, and you demanded blind obedience based on DNA. I opened the top drawer of the mahogany desk. I retrieved a single crisp manila envelope and tossed it onto the polished wood. It slid across the smooth surface, coming to a halt inches from his trembling hands. You are not here to negotiate, Richard. You are here because standard corporate protocol requires a terminated employee to be escorted off the premises to collect their final personal effects. That envelope contains a formal, non-negotiable eviction notice. Vanguard Apex Holdings is reclaiming all residential properties previously owned by the Bancroft estate, including the mansion. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before local law enforcement physically removes you. Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a loaded weapon. A fresh wave of tears spilled down his cheeks, a silent, devastated confirmation of his total ruin. He slowly reached out his shaking fingers, picking up the eviction notice. He did not say another word. There was absolutely nothing left to say. He bent down, picked up his sad little cardboard box, and turned around. The security guards immediately fell into step beside him, escorting the broken, bankrupt ghost of Richard Bancroft out of the office. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them with a definitive, resonant thud. The silence returned to the room, absolute and victorious. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy piece of polished obsidian. I placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany desk. The nameplate caught the morning light, the engraved silver letters gleaming with undeniable permanence. Madeline Helen, Chief Executive Officer. They stripped me of my title to give a crown to a fraud, forgetting that power doesn't come from a bloodline, it comes from the brains you use to build your empire. Have you ever had to take back your throne from the people who called themselves family? Share your story in the comments.